Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy, ancient places grow quiet in the dark, and the stories of our planet take the scenic route towards sleep. Tonight, we are travelling to a place where stone walls do not rise from the ground in the usual way. They do not stand proudly on a hilltop or spread across an open plain, or sit beneath the easy view of the sky. Instead, they are tucked into the side of a cliff, held in the shadow of sandstone, as if the canyon itself decided to keep a secret. This is Mesa Verde, a place where an ancient civilization built homes, rooms, towers, and ceremonial spaces inside great natural alcoves high above the canyon floor. From a distance, the buildings can look almost impossible. A city pressed into the rock, a village suspended between earth and air, a place where people once cooked, slept, raised children, stored corn, climbed ladders, watched the weather, and looked out from the shelter of the stone at a world that was changing around them. And before we step too far into those quiet cliffs, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Are you somewhere bright with morning light, somewhere deep in evening, or tucked into that gentle hour when the house finally settles and the day begins to loosen its grip? It is a fitting question, because Mesa Verde is a place that makes you aware of where you are. It makes you think about height, shelter, distance, silence, and the slow movement of time across stone. It makes you wonder what it would have felt like to wake up with sandstone overhead, instead of a roof of timber, to hear footsteps on ladders instead of streets, to look down into a canyon rather than out across a flat village square. If you find this kind of journey soothing, or if you enjoy wandering through old places without having to put on hiking boots, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like, maybe subscribed, and joined this quiet little corner of the world again. It helps these calm stories reach others who might also enjoy drifting through the mysteries of the earth at a slower pace. Now, settle in, let your thoughts slow down, and imagine the evening light falling across the high desert of the American Southwest. The sun is low, warm against the cliffs, turning the sandstone the colour of old honey and dry clay. Shadows gather in the canyon walls. Juniper trees and pinyon pines stand scattered across the mesa top, their shapes small and patient against the sky. The air is dry enough that sound seems to travel differently, clearer in some places, swallowed in others. A raven might pass overhead, black against the fading blue. Far below, the canyon floor rests in shadow. And there, tucked beneath a sweeping curve of stone, are the dwellings. They do not announce themselves loudly. They wait. They seem to belong to the cliff so completely that for a moment you might wonder whether they were built by human hands at all, or whether the canyon slowly dreamed them into shape. Mesa Verde means green table in Spanish, and that name fits the place in a simple, practical way. It is a mesa, a high, flat landform rising above the surrounding country, and in the right season it can seem surprisingly green compared with the dry lands around it. But that name only tells the first layer of the story. The deeper story belongs to the people who lived there long before it became a national park, long before modern visitors walked carefully along trails and looked up at those stone rooms with cameras in their hands. The people who built the famous cliff dwellings are often called Ancestral Puebloans, ancestors of many Pueblo peoples living today. For centuries they made their homes across the Four Corners region, where present-day Colorado, Utah, Arizona and New Mexico meet. They farmed, built, traded, prayed, adapted, remembered, and moved through a landscape that could be generous in one decade and unforgiving in another. When we first imagine an ancient city inside a cliff, it is easy to picture fear as the only reason, a hidden place, a defensive place, a place built high and hard to reach because danger waited outside. And yes, protection may have mattered. It would be strange to look at those alcoves perched above steep drops and reached by ladders, handholds and narrow paths, and not think about safety. But Mesa Verde was not only a fortress, it was a home. That difference matters. These walls were not built merely for hiding, they were built for living. There were storage rooms where corn could be kept dry. There were hearths where meals were prepared. There were plazas where people moved through daily tasks. There were kivas, round ceremonial rooms partly sunk into the earth, where community and ritual met in ways we can only partly understand. There were doorways small enough to make you stoop, rooms tucked closely together, and walls shaped by hands that knew exactly how stone, mud, and timber behaved in that climate. The great question is not simply why people built in cliffs. It is why they chose that way of life at that particular moment, after centuries of living mostly on the mesa tops. Because the cliff dwellings, as dramatic as they are, came relatively late in the long history of Mesa Verde. People had been living in the region for a very long time before the most famous alcove villages were built. Earlier communities farmed on the mesa tops, where fields could spread beneath the sun and homes could sit closer to crops. They learned the habits of the land, the timing of rain, the stubbornness of drought, the value of stored food, and the importance of community. They were not wandering through the landscape as if lost. They knew it deeply. They understood soil, water, seasons, wood, stone, and the difficult balance between staying and moving. So when some communities began building in the cliffs, it was not because they had suddenly discovered the canyon walls one afternoon and thought, well, that looks like a cozy place to put a neighbourhood. It was part of a larger shift, a change in settlement, in social life, in pressure, in the relationship between people and landscape. Mesa Verde asks us to think carefully, because the obvious answer may not be the complete one. The cliff alcoves offered shelter from rain and snow. They provided shade from harsh summer sun. They helped preserve buildings by protecting them from weather. They may have offered a better defensive position in unsettled times. They also created a powerful sense of enclosure, a feeling of being held by the land itself. If you have ever sat beneath a rock overhang during rain, even a small one, you know the strange comfort of it. The world continues outside, but you are under the stone, dry and still, listening as water falls just beyond reach. Now imagine that feeling multiplied into a whole community. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are often described as mysterious, and they are, but not because their builders were unknowable or strange. They are mysterious because we are separated from them by time, by silence, and by the limits of what stone can tell us. Archaeology can reveal walls, tools, pottery, tree ring dates, food remains, fire pits, and patterns of movement. It can show that people farmed corn, beans, and squash. It can show that they built with skill and repaired what they built. It can show trade connections, social changes, and signs of stress. But it cannot fully return a voice to every room. It cannot tell us exactly what a parent said to a child while climbing a ladder at dusk. It cannot give us the sound of mourning in an alcove when smoke from hearths rose gently against the rock ceiling. It cannot tell us what it felt like when the last families decided to leave. That leaving is one of the great quiet questions of Mesa Verde. The cliff dwellings were built with such care, and yet they were not occupied forever. By the late 13th century, the people of Mesa Verde had moved away, joining or becoming part of communities farther south and east, including regions connected with modern Pueblo peoples. For a long time, older stories describe this as a disappearance, as if the people simply vanished into the air. But that word can mislead us. They did not vanish. They migrated. They continued. Their descendants are still here. What ended was not a people, but a particular way of living in that particular place. The stone rooms remained, but the life that filled them moved onward. There is something deeply human in that. We often think of ancient ruins as abandoned because something failed. A drought came, a conflict grew, crops struggled, social ties changed. The old system could no longer hold, and in Mesa Verde all of those pressures may have played a role. But leaving can also be an act of survival, planning and courage. To stay in a place is one kind of strength. To know when to leave is another. The people who left Mesa Verde were not simply defeated by the land. They made choices in a hard world. They carried knowledge with them, and memory and traditions, and probably grief too. because homes do not become empty without leaving some trace inside the heart. Tonight's journey begins with that image of a city inside a cliff, but we should be careful with the word city. Mesa Verde was not a city in the modern sense, with busy avenues, markets, towers of glass, and someone somewhere complaining about parking. Its cliff dwellings were communities made of rooms, storage spaces, ceremonial areas, work areas, and paths. Some were small, some were large and complex. The most famous, Cliff Palace, contains many rooms and kivas, and it gives the impression of a dense, carefully organised world fitted into a natural stone shelter. But the word city still captures something useful. It reminds us that this was not a random shelter or a temporary camp. It was planned, inhabited, maintained, and socially meaningful. It was architecture shaped around community. It was a human answer to a landscape that asked difficult questions. Imagine standing across the canyon and seeing Cliff Palace for the first time. The alcove curves above it like a great stone eyebrow. The buildings rest beneath that curve, their walls pale and warm, their doorways dark. There is a strange balance between exposure and protection. The dwellings are visible, yet sheltered, open to the canyon, yet tucked away. High above the ground, yet anchored to stone. You might find yourself asking the same question again and again. Why here? Why this place? Why carry stones, timber, water, food, tools, and daily life into the cliff instead of remaining on the easier flatland above? But perhaps easier is not always safer, and safer is not always simpler. Perhaps the cliff offered advantages that only make sense when we remember the full world around it. The mesa top was where much of life depended on farming. Corn was central, and corn needs care. It needs planting, tending, harvesting, and storage. In dry lands, it needs rain at the right time, and when the rain does not come, every decision becomes heavier. A community must think not just about this season, but the next one. Not just about today's meal, but winter's storage. Not just about one household, but many households linked together. The cliff alcoves may have helped protect stored food from weather, animals, and perhaps from people outside the community. The shade and dryness of the alcoves made them useful places for preservation. The walls themselves, protected by the overhang, could last for centuries. In a region where wind, sun, and water all work slowly against exposed buildings, a roof made by geology is no small gift. But Mesa Verde was more than practical. Human beings rarely build only for practical reasons. Even the plainest home carries meaning. A doorway says something about welcome and privacy. A hearth says something about warmth and gathering. A ceremonial room says something about the unseen world that shaped daily life. To build inside a cliff may also have connected people to place in a powerful way. The alcove was not just a convenient shelter. It was part of the canyon, part of the earth, part of a landscape filled with memory and meaning. For Pueblo peoples today, landscapes are not empty backdrops. They're connected to origin, movement, ceremony, and identity. We should not flatten Mesa Verde into a puzzle of engineering alone. Its builders were not merely solving a construction problem. They were living in a world where land, community, ancestors, crops, seasons, and sacred responsibilities were woven together. That is why the cliff dwellings feel so compelling. They sit at the meeting point between survival and meaning. They are clever, yes, beautiful, certainly, but they are also intimate. Unlike many ancient monuments built to impress from far away, Mesa Verde pulls you inward. It asks you to imagine small rooms, low ceilings, stored grain, stone tools, woven sandals, pottery jars, smoke-darkened surfaces, and the soft scrape of daily work. It asks you to imagine children learning where to place their feet on ladders. It asks you to imagine elders watching the sky, noticing the clouds, reading the season. It asks you to imagine people measuring life not by clocks, but by the return of planting time, the ripening of corn, the drying of mud mortar, the need to repair a wall before winter. There is also the physical experience of height. Living in a cliff dwelling meant moving vertically through the world. Today, many of us move through buildings by stairs and elevators without thinking much about it. But in Mesa Verde, vertical movement was part of daily life. Ladders connected levels. Hand and toe holds cut into stone allowed movement along steep routes. Paths were narrow. The canyon was always nearby. This was not a place where you stumbled sleepily to the kitchen without paying attention. The landscape required awareness. Every journey from field to home, from home to water, from room to room, involved the body in a direct way. The cliff was not simply scenery. It shaped muscles, habits, dangers and routines. And yet we should not imagine life there as constantly grim or fearful. People are remarkably good at making ordinary life in extraordinary places. What seems impossible to a visitor may have been familiar to someone raised there. A child born in a cliff dwelling may have learned the ladders as naturally as another child learns a hallway. The height that makes us uneasy may have felt like home. The stone ceiling overhead may have felt protective rather than oppressive. The canyon view may have been part of mourning, as ordinary and beloved as the view from a kitchen window. That is one of the gentle lessons of Mesa Verde. Human beings can make homes in places that seem unlikely, not because they are strange, but because they are adaptable. We learn the shapes of our worlds, and then we build our lives into them. Still, there is a tension in the story. The cliff dwellings were built during a period that seems to have carried stress. Population, resources, climate, and social relations were all part of the larger picture. Archaeologists have found evidence that drought affected the region, especially in the late 1200s. Farming would have become harder. Water would have mattered even more. Communities may have drawn closer together, perhaps for cooperation, perhaps for defence, perhaps for both. When people cluster in protected places, it often means the world outside has become less predictable. Not necessarily a world of constant violence, but a world where caution has become wise. Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings may therefore represent both ingenuity and anxiety. They are beautiful, but they may also be the architecture of a society under pressure. That dual feeling is part of what makes them unforgettable. They are peaceful to look at now. Birds move through the alcoves. Sunlight comes and goes across empty walls. Visitors speak in lowered voices, as if the place itself has asked for quiet. But when those rooms were full, they were not museum pieces. They were alive with work, smoke, hunger, laughter, worry, ritual, repair, and decision. The silence we feel today is not the silence of the past. It is the silence left after life has moved elsewhere. So why did this ancient civilization build a city inside a cliff? The answer will not be one simple sentence. It will be a braid: shelter, storage, defense, climate, community, ceremony, identity, and change all twist together. The cliff was useful, but it was also meaningful. It protected, but it also gathered people close. It hid, but it also displayed a remarkable confidence in building. It answered practical needs, but it also expressed a relationship with the land that had been developing for generations. To understand Mesa Verde, we have to climb slowly into that braid, not tug at one strand and pretend we have solved the whole thing. As we move deeper into the story, we will begin not with the cliff dwellings themselves, but with the land around them. Because no place like Mesa Verde can be understood by looking only at walls. The walls came later. First there was the mesa, the canyon, the dry air, the seasonal rain, the stone that could be shaped, the plants that could survive, and the long patient presence of people learning how to live there. Before the great alcove villages, before the famous view of rooms beneath sandstone, before the question of why anyone would build so high above the canyon floor, there was the high desert itself, wide and quiet beneath the sky, waiting with all the difficulty and beauty that would shape everything built into its cliffs. To understand Mesa Verde, it helps to begin before the stone rooms, before the ladders, before the famous cliff dwellings that seem to hover in the canyon wall like something halfway between a home and a hidden thought. It helps to begin with the land itself, because the land was never just a background here. It was the first builder, It shaped the choices people made long before the first wall was raised beneath an overhang. It decided where water gathered, where corn might grow, where shade could be found, where winter wind would bite, and where a family might feel safe enough to sleep. Mesa Verde is not a place that hands out comfort easily. It is beautiful, yes, but not in the soft, generous way of a green valley, with a river wandering politely through the middle. Its beauty is sharper and drier. It asks more from anyone who lives there. It gives sunlight in abundance, but not always rain. It gives stone, but not endless wood. It gives open sky, but also long exposure. It gives views that can stretch for miles, but a view does not fill a storage jar with corn. The high desert around Mesa Verde belongs to a wider landscape of mesas, canyons, arroyos, sandstone cliffs, scrubby woodland, and open spaces where distance can trick the eye. Something that looks close may take much longer to reach than expected. A canyon that seems like a line in the land can suddenly become a serious obstacle. The mesa tops rise like broad tables above the surrounding country, which is how Mesa Verde received its name. From certain angles, the top looks flat and calm, but the land is cut by drainages and canyons that carry water only when the weather allows it. This is one of the first things to remember. Water here is not simply present. It is seasonal, uncertain, sometimes hidden, sometimes sudden. A storm can send water rushing through a dry channel, and then the same place may lie empty again, as if pretending nothing happened. For people who farmed, stored food, and raised families here, water was not scenery. It was a constant calculation. The elevation also matters. Mesa Verde sits high enough that the climate is not just desert heat from morning to night. There are cold winters, frosts, and seasons that require planning. Snow can fall. Nights can be surprisingly cool. The growing season is limited, and that makes agriculture more demanding. The people who lived here had to know when to plant, what the soil could handle, how much moisture remained from winter, and how to store enough food to survive the months when fields were not producing. Corn was central, but corn is not a magic plant. It does not simply appear because people need it. It must be planted at the right time, in the right place, with enough moisture to carry it through. Beans and squash helped round out the diet, and wild plants and animals added to what farming provided, but the whole system depended on a careful relationship with the land. One bad season was difficult. Several bad seasons could change everything. At first glance, the high desert might seem too harsh for settled life. That is an easy mistake to make from a modern distance, especially if we're used to thinking of good farmland as dark soil, steady rain, and fields that stretch conveniently beside a town. But ancient people were not waiting for perfect conditions. They learned the conditions they had. They noticed which slopes held moisture a little longer. They understood where frost lingered and where sunlight came early. They learned the habits of pinyon pine and juniper, the uses of yucca, the movement of deer, rabbits, turkeys, and birds. They knew which plants could be gathered, which fibres could be twisted, which seeds mattered, which roots helped, which woods burned hot, and which stones could be shaped into tools. To call the land harsh is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It was harsh and useful, difficult and familiar, demanding and known. Stone is everywhere in the story of Mesa Verde, but not all stone is the same. The cliffs and alcoves that later sheltered whole communities formed through long geological processes that began far beyond the reach of human memory. Layers of sandstone were laid down in ancient environments, compressed, shaped, lifted, and cut by erosion over immense stretches of time. Wind, water, freezing, thawing, and gravity did their patient work. Softer layers wore away more easily. Harder layers remained. In places, the erosion carved deep natural alcoves into the cliff faces, creating broad, sheltered spaces beneath overhanging stone. These alcoves were not caves in the simple sense. They were more like great shallow rooms made by geology, open to the canyon but roofed by rock. If you were looking for shelter in a dry land, they would have been hard to ignore. An alcove gives several gifts at once. It provides shade when the sun is harsh. It offers a roof against rain and snow. It protects walls from direct weather, which is one reason Mesa Verde's cliff dwelling survived so well after the people left. A building on an exposed mesa top must face wind, water, and temperature changes more directly. A building tucked beneath sandstone is still vulnerable, of course, but the overhang does part of the work. It is a little like parking a bicycle under a porch instead of leaving it in the street during a storm. The bicycle is still a bicycle, but it has a better chance of not looking personally offended by the weather in the morning. For ancient builders, the cliff overhang was not just convenient. It was a natural roof, one that could not be blown away, stolen, or patched badly by a tired uncle. But shelter was not just about keeping rain off the walls, it was also about temperature. Stone holds and releases heat in ways that matter deeply when people live close to it. A south-facing alcove can catch winter sunlight and remain more comfortable during cold months. In summer, the overhang can provide shade during the hottest parts of the day. The cliff itself becomes part of the household system, moderating the environment without anyone needing to invent a thermostat, argue over the thermostat, or secretly adjust it when no one is looking. This kind of passive climate control would have been valuable in a place where daily and seasonal temperature changes could be significant. It did not make life easy, but it made some places more livable than others. The mesa tops, though, were not empty or useless. In fact, they were essential. The fields were mostly above, where there was enough open space for farming. Before the great cliff dwellings became common, many people lived on or near those mesa tops for generations. They built pit houses, later surface rooms, storage features, and ceremonial spaces. They adapted their architecture over time. They did not begin with Cliff Palace or the great alcove villages. Those came after a long history of settlement, learning, and change. So when we imagine the high desert becoming shelter, we should not picture a sudden discovery, as if someone looked at a cliff one day and announced that the future of real estate had arrived. The people of Mesa Verde already understood the region. They had lived with its advantages and problems for centuries. Moving into alcoves was not the beginning of their story, but a later decision made by communities with deep local knowledge. The canyon landscape also created different zones of life. The mesa top offered fields, sunlight, and visibility. The canyon slopes and bottoms offered other resources, including plants, animals, stone, clay, and sometimes water. The alcove stood between these worlds. They were not completely isolated from the mesa top, but they were not as exposed as surface villages. To live in an alcove meant living in relation to vertical space. You might farm above, store food within the shelter, move down or across for water or resources, and climb between levels using paths, ladders, and handholds. The land was not a flat map, it was a stacked world. Daily life required knowing not only distance, but height. A place might be nearby as the raven flies, but not so nearby if you're carrying a jar, a bundle of wood, or a sleepy child who has decided that walking is no longer part of their personal philosophy. This vertical world shaped behaviour. It shaped how people moved, where they gathered, how they transported materials, and how they thought about safety. In open villages, movement could spread outward in many directions. In cliff dwellings, movement was channeled through routes that could be watched, controlled, or protected. That does not mean every cliff dwelling was built only for defence, but the defensive advantage is difficult to ignore. A narrow approach is easier to guard than an open settlement. A high alcove gives warning and visibility. Stored food and people could be placed in a more protected position. During times of social stress, even a small advantage could matter. But again, the land rarely gives one answer. The same alcove that helped protect a community also helped shelter its rooms, preserve its food, shade its people, and connect daily life to the stone body of the canyon. The high desert also demanded storage. This may sound ordinary, but storage is one of the great quiet engines of civilization. A community that farms in a risky environment must store enough food to survive poor seasons. Storage rooms are not glamorous in the way towers or ceremonial spaces are, but they are often more important than anything that photographs well. Corn had to be dried and protected from moisture, insects, rodents, and theft. The dry alcoves of Mesa Verde were well suited for keeping stored crops in better condition. In some places, storage rooms were tucked into protected spaces, and the architecture itself suggests that preserving food was a central concern. When you look at ancient walls, it is easy to admire their beauty first, but behind many of those walls was a practical question that every household understood. Will we have enough to eat when the fields are quiet? The surrounding plants also shaped life in small but constant ways. Pinyon pines provided nuts, which could be eaten and stored. Juniper offered wood, though wood had to be gathered and managed carefully. Yucca was especially useful. Its fibres could be made into cordage, sandals, mats, baskets, and other items. Wild plants provided food, medicine, and materials. Turkeys were kept by ancestral Pueblo people and were important for feathers and later as food. Dogs may have been part of life as well. This was not a simple corn village dropped into a barren wilderness. It was a complicated system of resources, each with its own timing and use. A good year meant more than rain. It meant successful planting, useful gathering, stored food, available fuel, stable social ties, and enough hands to do the work. Work is easy to overlook in ruins. Stone rooms can look peaceful after centuries of silence, but every wall at Mesa Verde represents labour. Stones had to be selected, shaped, carried, fitted and set with mortar. Timber had to be cut and transported. Water had to be brought for mixing mortar and for daily use. Floors needed preparation. Roofs required beams and smaller materials. Plaster might be applied and renewed. Smoke had to escape. Rooms had to be cleaned, repaired, repurposed, and sometimes rebuilt. The cliff did not simply become shelter on its own. It offered the possibility of shelter. People made it real through work. Lots of work. The kind of work that makes modern complaints about assembling flat-pack furniture seem, perhaps, slightly less heroic than we imagine. Still, the builders were not improvising blindly. Their masonry shows skill and experience. The walls were often made of shaped sandstone blocks set in mortar, with chinking stones used to fill gaps. The builders understood how to adapt rooms to irregular spaces. They did not force the cliff into a perfect geometric plan. They worked with it. This is one of the most striking things about Mesa Verde architecture. The alcove was not treated as an inconvenience. It was part of the design. Walls followed the available space. Rooms fit beneath the overhang. Some spaces were built tightly against the back of the alcove. Others opened toward plazas and work areas. The result can feel organic, not because it was accidental, but because it was carefully adjusted to the shape of the stone. The colour of the place matters too, not in a decorative sense, but in how it affects the feeling of the dwellings. The sandstone ranges through warm tones of tan, gold, cream and reddish brown. In changing light, the cliff can make the rooms seem to appear and disappear. Morning light reveals edges. Midday brightness flattens surfaces. Evening shadows return depth. The dwellings are not separate from the cliff visually. They share its colour. From a distance, a wall may look like a natural extension of the alcove until the eye catches a straight line, a doorway, a tower edge, a human decision. This blending may have been partly practical, simply a result of using local stone. But the effect is powerful. The buildings seem less like an intrusion, and more like a conversation with the canyon. The high desert also creates a special kind of silence, not total silence, because the land is never truly quiet. There is wind in the pinyon and juniper. There are birds, insects, distant calls, shifting gravel, the dry scrape of movement. But there is a spaciousness to the sound. The canyon can carry a voice in one direction and swallow it in another. A person living in an alcove would have known the sound of footsteps on ladders, the ring of stone against stone, the murmur of people working, the crackle of fire, and the sudden arrival of weather. Thunder in canyon country can feel close even when the storm is still far away. Rain, when it comes, changes everything. The smell of wet dust rises, water traces old channels, stone darkens. For farmers watching the sky, those moments were not just atmospheric, they were practical, emotional, and perhaps spiritual all at once. Season by season, the land asked different things. Spring brought planting decisions and hope, but also uncertainty. Summer could bring heat and the need for rain at just the right time. Late summer and autumn brought harvest, processing, drying, and storage. Winter brought cold, shorter days and reliance on what had been saved. The cliff alcoves changed with these seasons. A place warm and useful in winter might feel different in summer. A shaded work area could be a relief during heat. A protected storage room could matter most when snow or rain arrived. This is another reason the cliff dwelling should not be reduced to a single purpose. A home is not one tool. It is a bundle of answers to many daily problems. When modern visitors look at Mesa Verde, they often ask how people survived there. It is a fair question, but it can carry an assumption that survival in such a place was barely possible. The truth is more interesting. People did not merely survive at Mesa Verde for a short, desperate interval. They lived in the region for many centuries. They developed architecture, agriculture, social systems, craft traditions, and ceremonial life. They were not clinging to the edge of existence every moment. They had good years and hard years, routine days and extraordinary ones. They created communities that could support specialized knowledge and long-term planning. The existence of the cliff dwellings does not show that life was impossible. It shows that people were capable of adjusting to a place with intelligence and patience, and the land rewarded those who understood it. The mesa topsoils, when moisture allowed, could support crops. The broad views helped people track weather and movement. The canyons provided shelter and resources. The alcoves preserved what was built inside them. The dry climate helped protect organic materials that might vanish elsewhere. Baskets, sandals, wooden objects, and other fragile traces survived in ways that give archaeologists rare glimpses into daily life. Mesa Verde, in that sense, is both a home and an archive. The same dryness that made farming difficult helped preserve the evidence of the people who farmed there. The land was troublesome and generous in the same breath, which is very on brand for nature. The decision to build in stone beneath cliffs also reflects a long relationship with permanence and impermanence. On one hand, stone rooms look permanent to us. They have lasted for centuries. On the other hand, the people who built them eventually left. Their lives were mobile in the broader historical sense, not because they lacked attachment, but because movement was sometimes necessary. Ancient communities in the southwest often shifted settlement patterns in response to water, soil, social ties, religious responsibilities, and changing conditions. A stone wall can make us imagine that people intended to stay forever. But people can build strongly for the present without believing the present will never change. We do that too. We sign leases, paint walls, plant gardens, and buy furniture that is somehow both expensive and impossible to move gracefully. Human beings make homes, even knowing life may ask them to move. In Mesa Verde, stone became shelter because the land made stone available, because erosion made alcoves possible, because climate made protection valuable, and because generations of people had learned how to read the place. The cliff dwellings were not separate from the high desert. They were one answer to it. The overhangs, the dry air, the seasonal extremes, the farming risks, the need for storage, the social pressures, and the skills of the builders all came together. The result was architecture that seems dramatic now, but was also intensely practical then. It solved real problems in a real landscape. It made use of geology as if the canyon had offered half a house, and human hands completed the rest. As we keep moving through this story, the next step is to look more closely at the people themselves, not as shadows behind a ruin, and not as a vanished mystery, but as communities with long histories before the cliffs became famous. The Ancestral Puebloans did not appear at Mesa Verde only when the alcove walls were built. Their story reaches back through earlier homes, Older fields, changing tools, deep traditions, and centuries of adaptation on the mesa tops and beyond, where the long life before the cliffs was already shaping the choices that would one day bring whole communities under the shelter of sandstone. Before the people of Mesa Verde built their homes inside the cliffs, before those stone rooms appeared beneath the great sandstone overhangs, their story had already been unfolding for a very long time. The cliff dwellings are the part that catches the eye today, and understandably so. They are dramatic. They look almost unreal from across the canyon, tucked into the rock as if someone folded a village into the side of the earth and then stepped away quietly. But they were not the beginning. They were a later page in a much longer human story, one that began with smaller homes, older fields, changing tools, and generations of people learning what it meant to live in a land that could be both generous and difficult. Mesa Verde did not suddenly become home when the cliffs were used. It had already been home for centuries. The people we often call the Ancestral Puebloans were part of a broad and deeply rooted world across the American Southwest. That name matters because it reminds us that these were not vanished strangers with no connection to the present. They were ancestors of Pueblo peoples who still live today, including communities with long memories, living traditions, and continuing ties to these ancient places. Older writings sometimes used terms that made it sound as if the people had disappeared, as if Mesa Verde was a puzzle left behind by a lost race. That way of talking is misleading. The people moved, they changed, their descendants continued their lives elsewhere. The empty rooms are not proof of disappearance. They are evidence of a migration, a transition, and a long history that did not end when the cliff dwellings were no longer occupied. Long before the famous alcove villages, early communities in the Mesa Verde region lived in ways that were closely tied to farming, gathering, hunting, and seasonal movement. Over time, they grew more settled. Corn became central to life, along with beans and squash, those three reliable partners that supported so many agricultural societies across the Americas. Corn especially required patience and planning. It had to be planted, tended, harvested, dried, and stored. It tied people to place, because fields need attention, and storage gives a community a reason to stay close. A group that depends heavily on stored crops begins to think differently about shelter, land, labour, and the future. You're not only eating what the day provides, you're preparing for months you cannot yet see. Early homes were often partly dug into the ground. These are usually called pit houses, and they made a great deal of sense in the Mesa Verde environment. A pit house used the earth itself as insulation. The lower part was dug below the surface, and the roof was built above using timber, brush, mud, and other materials. In summer, the earth helped keep the inside cooler. In winter, it helped hold warmth. This was not primitive in the sense of careless or simple. It was intelligent architecture for a place with heat, cold, wind, and limited resources. A pit house did what a good home should do. It worked with the land rather than pretending the land was not there. Inside these homes, daily life was practical and close. There would have been hearths, stored food, tools, baskets, grinding stones, and the ordinary clutter of human living. We tend to imagine ancient homes as tidy because ruins are tidy in their emptiness. But real homes are rarely museum neat. There would have been work happening, meals being prepared, children moving around, tools being repaired, seeds being sorted, fibres being twisted, corn being ground, and someone somewhere probably looking for a missing object that had been placed in a perfectly sensible spot 5 minutes earlier. The people of early Mesa Verde were not living in a still photograph. They were living full, busy lives. As generations passed, architecture changed. People began building more above-ground rooms. Settlements became more organised. Villages grew in size and complexity. Instead of scattered households alone, communities formed with shared spaces and repeated building patterns. Storage rooms became important. Kivas, those round ceremonial rooms that would later become so recognisable in Pueblo architecture, developed from earlier pit house forms. This is a key point. The ceremonial spaces of later Mesa Verde did not appear from nowhere. They grew out of older ways of building and gathering. The past remained present in the shape of the architecture. A room partly sunk into the earth could become not just a dwelling, but a place of ceremony, meeting, memory, and identity. The kiva is one of the most important features in the story of the Ancestral Puebloans, though we have to speak carefully about it. Archaeologists can describe the shape, the features, the floor, the hearth, the ventilation shaft, and sometimes the small opening in the floor known as a sipapu in later Pueblo tradition. But the full meaning of these spaces belongs to cultures and traditions that should not be reduced to a few easy sentences. What we can say is that kivas were more than ordinary rooms. They were community spaces, ceremonial spaces, and places connected with the deeper organization of life. At Mesa Verde, kivas later appeared within cliff dwellings, but their roots go back into this longer history of living, building, gathering, and remembering. Pottery also tells part of the story. Early communities used baskets extensively, and basketry remained important, but pottery changed what people could do. Clay vessels could hold, cook, store, and serve food in new ways. Pottery also carried style. Designs on vessels can reveal connections between communities, changes over time, and shared ideas across wide regions. A pot is not just a container. It is also a record of hands, habits, taste, and tradition. When archaeologists find pottery fragments, they are not just finding broken things. They are finding clues to movement, trade, social identity, and daily routine. The smallest shard can sometimes say, quietly but clearly, someone made this here, or someone brought this from far away. The ancestral Puebloans were not isolated from the wider world. The Mesa Verde region was part of networks that connected people across large distances. Ideas moved, goods moved, designs changed. Turquoise, shells, pottery styles, and other materials show that communities were aware of one another and connected through exchange, travel, marriage, ceremony, or other relationships. The Southwest was not a silent emptiness dotted with separate villages. It was a living region of communication and influence. People knew of places beyond their own fields. They had relatives, partners, obligations, and stories that reached across the landscape. One of the larger influences in the region was Chaco Canyon, far to the south in present-day New Mexico. Chaco was a major center, with great houses, roads, ceremonial spaces, and signs of wide regional importance. Mesa Verde communities were not simply copies of Chaco, but they were part of a world in which Chacoan influence mattered at different times. Architecture, trade, ritual connections, and social relationships may have linked Mesa Verde to broader patterns. This reminds us that the people of Mesa Verde were not only responding to local weather and local cliffs, they were part of a social world. Their choices were shaped by neighbours, distant centres, shared beliefs, changing alliances, and perhaps the rise and decline of powerful regional systems. Over centuries, the population of the Mesa Verde area grew. Villages became larger and more settled. People invested more labour into architecture and storage. Farming expanded into places where it was possible, though always with the risk that the climate might not cooperate. When farming supports more people, it also creates new pressures. More fields are needed. More wood is gathered. More water is required. More food must be stored. More relationships must be managed. A larger community can offer security, cooperation, and shared labour, but it can also bring tension. Anyone who has tried to organise a small family gathering knows that even a handful of people can produce surprisingly complicated negotiations. Now imagine whole communities balancing land, food, ceremony, leadership, kinship, and survival across generations. This long period before the cliff dwellings was not one unchanging way of life. It was a series of adaptations. People moved homes, they changed settlement locations, they altered building styles, they adjusted farming methods, They responded to droughts, better rainfall periods, population shifts, and social change. This is important because ancient societies are sometimes described as if they were frozen in one form until something dramatic happened. But the people of Mesa Verde were always changing. They were not waiting passively for crisis. They were experimenting, remembering, and reorganizing. Their later move into cliff alcoves was part of this pattern of adaptation, not a strange break from a simple past. The mesa-top villages that came before the cliff dwellings would have felt different from the alcove settlements. They were closer to fields, more open to the sky, and easier to move through horizontally. Rooms could be grouped in blocks, plazas could form between structures, storage could be placed near households. People could walk between homes without climbing steep routes or using ladders over empty space. In many ways, mesa-top living was more convenient. So when communities later shifted some of their homes into cliffs, we should notice the cost. It took work. It made some daily tasks harder. Materials had to be carried. Fields were still mostly above. Water access could be challenging. You do not move into a cliff alcove because you're looking for the easiest possible commute to the cornfield. That tells us something changed. Not all at once, perhaps, and not everywhere in the same way, but enough that the advantages of alcove living began to outweigh the inconvenience. The long life before the cliffs helps us see this clearly. The people already knew how to farm. They already knew how to build. They already had villages, storage systems, ceremonial spaces, and regional connections. They did not need the cliffs in order to become a society. They turned to the cliffs after they had already built a complex world. That makes the decision more meaningful. It was not the beginning of civilization at Mesa Verde. It was a response by an experienced civilization to new circumstances. We can imagine, carefully, what life might have looked like in the centuries before the alcove villages. Morning on the mesa top would have begun with work, fires stirred, food prepared, corn ground on stone, a slow and repetitive task that shaped bodies over time. Farmers watched the weather. Children learned by watching and helping. Elders carried knowledge of seasons, places, stories, and responsibilities. People repaired roofs, shaped tools, made pottery, wove baskets, cared for turkeys, gathered plants, and visited neighbouring households. Ceremony and community life marked time in ways that were not separate from daily survival. The sacred and the practical were not two separate boxes. They lived together, as they often do in human societies. The work of grinding corn deserves a moment, because it was one of those ordinary tasks that quietly supported everything else. Corn had to be processed before it could become food. Grinding stones, often used by women, turned kernels into meal through repeated motion. It was hard work. It took time. It left traces on bones and tools. When we look at a cliff dwelling or an early village, we might focus on walls and rooms, but the real life of the place depended on repeated labour like this. Civilization is not only built by dramatic decisions, it is built by daily tasks done again and again until they become the rhythm of a household. Children in these communities would have grown up learning the land as naturally as language. They would know where certain plants grew, where paths led, where danger lay, where shade could be found, and which adults were patient enough to answer questions. They would learn how to move through the built environment, how to carry water, how to help with crops, how to listen during ceremonies, how to behave around storage areas, tools, animals, and fire. The past can feel distant until we remember that every ancient society was full of children, becoming adults one ordinary day at a time. A ruin has no age in the moment we see it, but the people who lived there did. They were babies, children, teenagers, parents, grandparents, and elders. They laughed, worried, taught, argued, and grew tired. History becomes more real when we let it be human. The ancestral Puebloans were also skilled makers. They shaped stone tools, made sandals from yucca fibre, wove baskets, formed pottery, built walls, prepared plaster, worked wood, and created objects that were both useful and meaningful. A sandal, for example, is not just footwear. It is a response to terrain. It tells us about movement, materials, and daily need. A basket is not just a container. It represents plant knowledge, technique, time, and design. A wall is not just a wall. It is planning, labour, and cooperation made visible. When we say these communities adapted to the Mesa Verde landscape, we should not imagine adaptation as a vague idea. It was there in every tool, every field, every storage room, every roof beam, every path worn by feet. There were also challenges building slowly beneath the surface of this long story. The environment of the Mesa Verde region could support life, but it could not be forced endlessly. Population growth may have placed pressure on fields, wood supplies, and wild resources. Farming in a dry region is always vulnerable to rainfall patterns. A few good years can encourage expansion. A few bad years can expose the limits of that expansion. Drought is not just a lack of rain, it is a social event. It changes the mood of a community. It makes storage more important, sharing more complicated, and decisions more urgent. It can strain relationships between households and villages. It can make old arrangements feel uncertain. By the time the most famous cliff dwellings were built in the later period of occupation, the people of Mesa Verde had inherited centuries of knowledge and centuries of pressure. They knew how to build above-ground room blocks. They knew how to construct kivas. They knew how to farm the mesa tops and store crops. They knew the canyons and alcoves. They knew the roots, the water sources, the useful plants, the building stone, and the weather signs. So the move into the cliffs should be seen as informed, deliberate, and practical. It was not a mystery in the sense of people doing something irrational. It was a decision that made sense within a world of environmental stress, social change, protection, storage, and community organization. The phrase Ancestral Puebloans covers many people across time and space, so we should be careful not to make them all sound the same. Communities differed. Traditions changed. Not everyone lived in the same kind of settlement or made the same choices at the same moment. Some places were occupied while others were left. Some villages grew while others declined. The story is not a straight line from pit house to pueblo to cliff dwelling, as if history were a neat staircase. It is more like a network of paths crossing a wide landscape. Some paths led to Mesa Verde's alcoves. Others led elsewhere. Some old practices continued, some changed. Some were carried forward into later Pueblo worlds in ways that still matter today. This continuing connection is one of the most important things to hold in mind. Mesa Verde is not merely an archaeological site, it is an ancestral place. For descendant communities, these sites can hold memory, meaning, and responsibility. Modern visitors may see beauty and mystery, but Pueblo descendants may also see connections to ancestors, migrations, teachings, and histories that are still alive. This should change the way we look at the cliff dwellings. They are not abandoned props for our curiosity. They are part of a living human story. The silence of the stone does not mean the story has no voice. It means we need to listen in a different way. When people finally began building the great cliff dwellings, they brought this long inheritance with them. They did not enter the alcoves empty-handed. They brought farming knowledge, architectural skill, ceremonial traditions, pottery styles, storage practices, social organization, and generations of experience with the high desert. The cliffs became famous because they are visually extraordinary, but the real foundation of Mesa Verde was built long before those walls appeared under the overhangs. It was built in pit houses, fields, storage rooms, family routines, ceremonies, and the memory of how to survive in a dry and changeable land. So when we ask why an ancient civilization built a city inside a cliff, we're really asking why a long-established people, with centuries of experience, chose to reshape their living spaces in a dramatic way. The answer begins with who they already were. Farmers, builders, makers, observers, travellers, parents, storytellers, ceremonial communities, and descendants of earlier generations who had learned the mesa step by step. They were not defined only by the cliffs. The cliffs were one expression of a much longer life, and as that life moved toward the period of the great alcove dwellings, the question becomes more focused, because if these people already knew the mesa tops so well, and if they already had homes, fields and communities under the open sky, then something about the cliff overhangs must have offered a new kind of answer when the old ways of living began to face new demands. The decision to build beneath a cliff overhang was not a small adjustment. It was not like moving a chair to the other side of a room because the light was better there. It meant changing the way a community lived, moved, stored food, watched its surroundings, and organised its daily work. The people of Mesa Verde already knew how to build on the mesa tops. They already had fields under the open sky, homes near those fields, and generations of experience with the land. So when they began placing whole settlements beneath sandstone alcoves, high above the canyon floor, the choice was telling us something. It was not a random experiment, it was a careful answer to several problems at once. The first and simplest reason was shelter. A cliff overhang is a natural roof, and in a place like Mesa Verde, a roof is not just about comfort. It is about survival, preservation, and effort saved. The sandstone alcoves protected buildings from direct rain, snow, hail, and some of the harshest sunlight. Walls built on exposed mesa tops had to face the weather directly. Wind carried sand, rain softened mortar, snow collected on roofs, heat expanded materials, and cold contracted them. Over time, all of that worked against a building. Beneath an overhang, the cliff did some of that work for the builders. It blocked part of the weather before it reached the rooms. It kept many surfaces drier. It made the buildings last longer with less constant repair. This matters because ancient architecture was not built and then simply forgotten until it became a ruin. Homes needed maintenance, roofs needed attention, walls needed patching. Plaster wore away, mortar cracked, wood aged. Every repair took time, material and labour. In a farming society, labour was already stretched across many tasks. People had to plant, weed, harvest, grind corn, collect fuel, gather wild foods, maintain tools, care for children, prepare meals, take part in community life, and respond to whatever the weather decided to do. Any place that reduced the burden of repair would have been valuable. The cliff did not eliminate work, but it helped. It provided a roof so large and strong that no household had to cut beams for it, lift it into place, or patch it after a storm. The overhang also helped with temperature. Mesa Verde's climate can bring hot days, cold nights, winter snow, and strong seasonal shifts. The stone alcoves offered shade during parts of the year and protection from wind in others. Depending on the direction the alcove faced, it could catch winter sunlight while remaining shaded during hotter months. This kind of natural temperature control would not have made the rooms feel like a modern house, of course. There were no sealed windows, no central heating, no convenient button to press when someone decided the room was either too warm, too cold, or somehow both. But the alcove created a more stable microclimate than a fully exposed surface settlement. Even small differences in warmth, shade, and dryness could matter when people lived through many seasons in the same place. Storage may have been one of the strongest practical reasons. The people of Mesa Verde depended heavily on crops, especially corn, and in a dry farming region, stored food was security. A good harvest had to be protected. Corn had to remain dry. It had to be kept away from animals, insects, dampness, and people who might try to take it during hard times. A storage room tucked beneath a dry sandstone overhang had real advantages. The alcove protected stored crops from direct rain and snow. The dry air helped reduce spoilage. The placement could make food stores easier to guard and harder to reach without permission. When a community's future depended on what had been saved from the last growing season, a protected storage space was not a minor convenience. It was one of the foundations of life. It is easy to stand in front of a cliff dwelling today and focus on the beauty of the stonework, the unusual setting, and the mystery of the empty rooms. But for the people who lived there, one of the most important questions may have been very direct. Will our food last? That question shaped architecture in many farming societies. It shaped where people built, how they organised rooms, how they protected supplies, and how they planned for winter. In Mesa Verde, the cliff overhang made storage safer in several ways at once. It kept things dry, it placed them within a controlled living area. It may have reduced theft or loss, and perhaps just as important, it gave the community confidence that what they worked so hard to grow could be preserved. Protection is another reason, and probably the one many people think of first. A village built high in an alcove is harder to enter than one on open ground. Routes into many cliff dwellings were limited. Access could involve ladders, narrow paths, carved hand and toe holds, or steep approaches. That made movement more difficult for outsiders and easier for residents to control. If a community was worried about conflict, raids, theft, or rising tension with neighbouring groups, a cliff dwelling offered clear defensive advantages. People could see across the canyon. They could control entry points. They could pull up ladders or guard narrow approaches. The land itself became part of their security. But it would be too simple to say the cliff dwellings were only fortresses. They were homes. They held families, storage rooms, ceremonial spaces, work areas, and daily routines. A place built only for defence might look and function differently. Mesa Verde's alcove settlements show a mix of needs. They were protected, yes, but also organised for living. The people who built them were not hiding every hour of the day. They still farmed on the mesa tops. They still moved through the wider landscape. They still needed water, fuel, fields, and social connections. So protection was likely part of the reason, but it was woven together with shelter, storage, community, and the changing pressures of the late period. Those pressures are important. The most famous cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde were built during a time when life in the region appears to have become more difficult. The late 1200s brought serious drought. Farming became less reliable. Population pressures may have strained resources. Social tensions may have increased. In such a world, living arrangements that had once worked well could start to feel less secure. Communities may have chosen alcoves because they offered a way to draw people closer together and protect what mattered most. The cliff did not solve the drought. It did not make corn grow without rain. It did not make every problem disappear, but it could help a community manage risk. Risk management sounds like a modern phrase, something that belongs in an office meeting with a chart no one truly wants to look at. But ancient people managed risk constantly. They stored food, they planted in different locations, they shared labour, they built in ways that responded to weather. They maintained ties with other groups, they watched the seasons. The move beneath overhangs may have been another form of risk management, a decision that combined practical advantages into one location. Better shelter for buildings, better protection for supplies, greater control over access, stronger community clustering, a closer relationship with certain ceremonial spaces, a more durable home during uncertain times. The overhang also shaped the social life of the community. When rooms were built into an alcove, people lived close together. Space was limited by the shape of the cliff. Builders could not simply expand in all directions as they might on the mesa top. They had to fit rooms, storage spaces, kivas, plazas, and passageways into the available shelter. This created dense settlements where households were physically near one another. Such closeness could strengthen cooperation. It could make shared work easier. It could help protect children, elders, food, and ceremonial areas. It could also create tension, because close living is rarely peaceful every single day. Even the calmest ancient village probably had its share of disagreements, awkward conversations, and someone who borrowed a tool and returned it in a condition that raised serious questions. Still, clustering mattered. A community facing stress may choose to live closer together, because cooperation becomes more important. Building beneath an overhang required planning and coordination. Walls had to fit the space. Routes had to remain usable. Kivas and rooms had to be arranged carefully. Storage had to be protected. This kind of construction suggests more than individual households acting alone. It suggests community decisions, shared labour, and some level of organisation. The cliff dwelling itself became a social structure as well as a physical one. Its shape influenced how people met, moved, worked, and watched over each other. The spiritual or ceremonial importance of the alcove should not be ignored. We have to be cautious because we cannot simply invent meanings and place them on the past as if they were labels in a museum. But among Pueblo peoples, landscapes can hold deep significance. Canyons, springs, mountains, directions, openings in the earth, and places connected with emergence and movement may carry meanings that outsiders do not fully understand. A cliff alcove is a powerful place. It is part shelter, part opening, part boundary between the interior of the earth and the open air. To build there may have meant more than practical safety. It may have placed the community in a meaningful relationship with the stone, the canyon, the earth, and the ancestors. The kivas inside many Mesa Verde cliff dwellings make this point stronger. These round ceremonial spaces were not added as afterthoughts. They were central features of community life. In some cliff dwellings, kivas were placed within plazas or room blocks in ways that show they mattered deeply. The alcove sheltered not only sleeping rooms and storage areas, but also places of ritual and gathering. That tells us the cliff dwelling was not simply a storage bunker or emergency shelter. It was a lived and meaningful space where daily survival and ceremonial life existed together. People did not separate practical and sacred life as sharply as modern categories sometimes do. The same community that stored corn beneath the overhang also gathered for ceremonies beneath that same stone ceiling. The natural shape of the alcove may also have influenced how sound, light, and movement were experienced. A broad stone overhang changes acoustics. Voices can echo or soften. Drums, footsteps, and speech may carry differently under rock than in open air. Light enters from the front while the back remains shaded. Fires glow against stone, smoke rises and stains surfaces. The changing sun marks time across walls and plazas. The cliff is not a silent container. It affects the senses. It shapes what people hear, see, smell, and feel. Over years, those sensory experiences become part of home. A person might know the hour by the angle of light in the alcove, the season by the warmth of the wall, the weather by the way wind entered the space. Another reason to build beneath an overhang was that the cliff created a clear boundary. In an exposed village, the edge of the settlement may blend more gradually into fields, paths, and open land. In an alcove, the boundary is obvious. Inside is the sheltered community. Outside is the canyon, the slope, the route upward, the route down. That boundary could have practical and social meaning. It made the living area easier to define and perhaps easier to defend. It may also have reinforced group identity. The people who lived within a particular alcove shared not only walls but an enclosed place. They belonged to that shelter, and the shelter belonged to their shared life. We should also think about visibility. Cliff dwellings are hidden in one sense, but visible in another. From certain angles they are hard to spot. Their stone walls blend with the sandstone. From across the canyon, though, a large dwelling like Cliff Palace can be seen clearly. It is not buried underground. It is not invisible. This creates an interesting balance. The dwellings may have been protected and partly concealed, but they also made a statement. They showed skill, organisation, and presence. They said in stone that a community lived here and knew how to build with the canyon. In uncertain times, visibility can be complicated. You may want to be hard to reach, but not necessarily unknown. You may want others to see that you are organised, prepared, and not easily approached. The effort required to build in an alcove also suggests that the choice had to offer real value. Carrying materials into cliff spaces was not easy. Stone could often be found locally, but it still had to be selected and moved. Mortar required water and sediment. Timber beams had to be cut and transported, sometimes from a distance. Food, tools, pottery, and daily supplies had to be carried into the dwelling. Water had to be brought in regularly unless a nearby seep or spring was available. Fields were often above, meaning people had to climb between home and work. This was not convenient in the simple sense. The fact that people accepted those difficulties tells us the advantages were significant. Water is especially important here. Some cliff dwellings were located near seep springs, where water slowly emerged from the sandstone. A seep is not a rushing river. It may be a modest but valuable source of moisture, sometimes dripping or trickling from the rock. In a dry region, even small water sources matter. Living near one could reduce the burden of carrying water, though it would not remove the need for careful management. The presence of water may help explain why certain alcoves were chosen over others. Not every overhang became a major dwelling. The right place needed enough space, access, shelter, relation to fields, and often proximity to water or routes to water. The cliff offered possibilities, but people still had to choose wisely. The orientation of an alcove mattered too. A south or east-facing shelter could receive useful sunlight, especially in colder seasons. Other alcoves might be too shaded, too exposed, too difficult to reach, or too far from fields. The builders were not simply looking for the most dramatic location. They were looking for workable places. A site had to support daily life, not just impress future visitors. This is worth remembering because modern eyes are often drawn to the spectacular. Ancient builders were drawn to what worked. If it happened to look spectacular as well, that was a bonus, though probably not the main item on the household planning list. Building beneath an overhang also meant building with the existing landscape rather than against it. The alcove provided the back wall, the roof, the outer frame, and often part of the settlement's shape. Human construction filled in what nature had begun. This partnership between geology and architecture is one reason Mesa Verde feels so distinctive. The dwellings do not sit on the land as separate objects. They are inserted into it. Their walls follow the curve of the cliff. Their rooms adjust to uneven surfaces. Their plazas open where the alcove allows them. This kind of building required attention. The builders had to understand the strengths and limits of the stone shelter. They had to know where walls could stand, where water might run, where roofs could fit, where smoke would collect, and where people could pass safely. The overhang also helped preserve privacy and control within a dense settlement. Rooms could be arranged so that some areas were more public and others more restricted. Storage rooms could be placed in less accessible positions. Kivas could be reached from shared spaces. Doorways could be small, partly for structural and practical reasons, but also creating controlled movement between rooms. When a community lives in a bounded alcove, architecture becomes a way of organizing relationships. Who can go where? Which spaces are shared? Which are household spaces? Where is food kept? Where do people gather? How do visitors enter? The cliff did not answer those questions by itself, but it made them more focused. There may also have been a psychological comfort in the overhang. Shelter changes how people feel. A roof gives a sense of being held, protected, and separated from the wide uncertainty outside. In a place where weather, crop success, and social relations could be unpredictable, the stone ceiling of an alcove may have offered more than physical protection. It may have felt stable. The cliff had been there long before any person arrived, and it would remain long after individual lives ended. To build beneath it was to place the fragile routines of human life under something immense and enduring. That feeling can matter. People do not choose homes only with their hands and stomachs. They choose them with memory, fear, hope, and belonging. At the same time, living beneath an overhang had disadvantages. The space was limited. Smoke could collect if ventilation was poor. Access could be difficult. Carrying water and crops was hard work. The risk of falling was real. Sanitation in dense settlements required care. Noise and closeness may have been constant. The cliff protected from some dangers, but introduced others, so the decision was a trade. The people of Mesa Verde did not find a perfect solution. They found a workable one for a specific historical moment. That is often how human life works. We rarely choose between perfect and terrible. We choose between several imperfect options and then make a home inside the one that seems most likely to carry us through. By the late 13th century, however, even the advantages of the cliff alcoves were not enough to keep people in Mesa Verde permanently. Drought, resource stress, social changes and broader regional movements led communities away. This does not mean the decision to build under overhangs failed. For a time, it served real needs. It helped people live, store, gather, and protect themselves in a changing world. The fact that the dwellings were later left does not make their construction a mistake. A shelter can be valuable even if it is not forever. A home can matter deeply, even if one day the door is closed for the last time. So why build beneath an overhang? Because the overhang was roof, shade, storage protection, defensive advantage, social boundary, ceremonial setting, and part of a meaningful landscape all at once. It answered several questions with one stone curve. Where can walls last longer? Where can food be kept safer? Where can people gather closer together? Where can entry be controlled? Where can winter sun and summer shade help daily life? Where can a community place itself when the mesa top no longer feels like enough? The answer, for a time, was inside the cliff, and once people made that decision, the cliff dwelling became a world of its own. It was not only a clever location, but a working settlement filled with rooms, ladders, passageways, storage spaces, hearths, plazas, and kivas. Its design shaped every movement of the day. To understand what it meant to live there, we have to step past the first question of why the overhang was chosen and begin looking at how life actually worked inside it, where stone walls held households close together and the path from one place to another might lead across a plaza, down a ladder, through a low doorway, or past the round ceremonial rooms that anchored the community beneath the cliff. A cliff dwelling at Mesa Verde was not just a place to look at from across a canyon. It was a working home, a community fitted into stone, a place where daily life had to be organised around height, narrow space, shared walls, stored food, ladders, smoke, ceremony, and the constant demands of the land above. From a distance, the great dwellings can seem almost still, as if they were made only for silence. But when people lived there, they would have been full of movement. Feet crossed packed floors, hands carried jars, baskets, tools, firewood, and food. Children learned where they could run and where they absolutely could not, because the edge of the alcove was not a forgiving playground. Voices passed through rooms and plazas, smoke curled up from hearths, corn was ground, walls were repaired, ladders creaked under use, turkeys moved and called. Someone likely dropped something at the worst possible moment and had to watch it bounce down into a place that made retrieving it very inconvenient. To understand life above the canyon floor, it helps to first let go of the idea that these cliff dwellings were one single kind of building. They were not simple houses carved into rock. They were clusters of rooms, open spaces, storage areas, ceremonial structures, passageways, and routes of movement. Some rooms were small and practical. Some were used for living, others for storage, others for work. The layout depended on the shape of the alcove, the needs of the community, and the way people added or changed spaces over time. The cliff gave the frame, but people filled that frame with decisions. They decided where a wall should stand, where a doorway should open, where a storage room would stay dry, where a kiva would sit, and where people could pass safely without making everyday life feel like a difficult puzzle. The rooms themselves were often built from sandstone blocks shaped and fitted with mortar. Many were compact by modern standards. Doorways could be low and narrow. Ceilings were not always high. Some spaces may have felt dim, especially toward the back of the alcove. But small rooms made sense. Smaller spaces were easier to roof, easier to warm, and easier to build within the uneven limits of the cliff shelter. In a world without modern heating, wide glass windows, or a convenient hardware store waiting nearby, every bit of material mattered. A room did not need to be large to be useful. It needed to serve its purpose. It needed to hold people, food, tools, or activities in a way that worked for the household and the community. The roofs of rooms were made with wooden beams, smaller sticks, plant material, and mud or plaster. Timber was valuable because suitable trees had to be found, cut, carried, and placed. In a dry landscape, wood was not something to waste casually. The beams used in construction also help archaeologists date buildings through tree ring analysis, which has given a clearer picture of when different parts of Mesa Verde were built. But for the people living there, beams were not scientific evidence. They were part of the home. They held up the roof. They made an enclosed space possible. They required labour, planning, and cooperation. A beam above a room was not just wood. It was someone's trip into the landscape, someone's cutting work, someone's carrying work, and someone's careful placement under stone. Plaster covered many walls. Some rooms would have been more finished than they appear today. The bare stone we see now is partly the result of time. In the past, wall surfaces may have been smoothed, renewed, and sometimes decorated. Plaster helped seal walls, improve surfaces, and make rooms more comfortable. It also required maintenance. When you live in a home, surfaces are never finished forever. They wear, they crack, they smoke, they need attention. Ancient people knew this just as well as anyone who has ever looked at a wall in their own home and thought, yes, that needs fixing, and then politely ignored it for several months. Because the cliff dwellings were dense, rooms often sat close together in blocks. This created a strong sense of shared life. People could hear one another. They crossed common areas. They moved through tight passageways and past the edges of other households. Privacy would have existed, but not in the modern sense of a detached house with a fence, a driveway, and a doorbell that somehow always rings at the least convenient time. Mesa Verde's cliff communities were built around closeness. That closeness could be practical. It made cooperation easier. It helped people protect stored goods. It brought families and neighbours within reach. But it also meant daily life required social skill. People had to share space, respect boundaries, negotiate use of work areas, and live with the sounds and habits of others. Storage rooms were among the most important spaces. They could be small, sealed, elevated, or placed in protected locations. Stored corn and other foods were the community's future made visible. A storage room might not look as dramatic as a tower or a kiva, but it carried enormous importance. In a dry farming society, stored food was the difference between confidence and worry. Crops harvested in one season had to feed people through another. Good storage protected against spoilage, animals, moisture, and theft. Within the cliff dwelling, storage was often integrated into the settlement in ways that allowed families and groups to guard what they had saved. A wall around stored food was also a wall around time, because it protected the months ahead. There were also working spaces where daily tasks took place. Corn had to be ground, and grinding was slow, physical labour. People used stone tools, often metates and manos, to turn kernels into meal. This work would have made a steady sound, a rough rhythm of stone against stone. It was one of the ordinary sounds of life in many Pueblo communities. Food preparation took time and skill. Meals did not appear from a cupboard after a few quick clicks and a suspiciously cheerful kitchen timer. They required planting months earlier, harvesting at the right time, drying, storing, grinding, cooking, and sharing. Every meal was tied to a long chain of work. Hearths and fire were central to life, but fire inside a cliff dwelling brought its own challenges. Smoke had to go somewhere. In enclosed or semi-enclosed spaces, it could stain walls and ceilings, irritate eyes, and settle into clothing and hair. Some rooms show smoke blackening, reminding us that warmth and cooking came with discomfort. Fires also required fuel, which meant gathering wood or other burnable material. In the Mesa Verde landscape, fuel had to be managed carefully. Every stick burned was part of the relationship between people and the surrounding woodland. Over time, fuel use could affect nearby resources, especially when populations grew, so even a small hearth connects us to a larger environmental story. Movement through the cliff dwellings was one of the most distinctive parts of life. Ladders were essential. They connected levels, gave access to rooms, allowed entry into kivas, and linked the settlement to paths leading up to the mesa or down into the canyon. Today, a ladder in a cliff dwelling looks adventurous, perhaps even charming. For the people who lived there, it was part of ordinary movement. They climbed while carrying food, tools, water, wood, baskets, or children. They climbed in morning light, evening shadow, cold weather, and perhaps during storms. They learned balance and caution early. A ladder was not a museum feature. It was a hallway made vertical. Some routes used hand and toe holds carved into stone. These could allow people to move along steep surfaces that seem alarming to modern visitors. But once again, what seems frightening to us may have been familiar to those raised in that landscape. The human body learns its environment. A child who grows up using ladders and stone holds may move with confidence where an outsider freezes and begins quietly reconsidering every life choice. Still, the danger was real. Life above the canyon floor required attention. A careless step could matter. This shaped habits. People learned where to place their feet, when to carry something, when to ask for help, and when not to hurry. Water movement was especially demanding. Some cliff dwellings were near seep springs, where water emerged slowly from the sandstone, but water still had to be collected and managed. If water had to be brought from another location, carrying it into an alcove added labour to daily life. Pottery jars could be heavy, especially when full. A person carrying water up or down routes in the canyon had to balance carefully. Water for drinking, cooking, mixing mortar and other uses was too valuable to waste. The presence or absence of nearby water likely influenced which alcoves became major homes. The cliff could offer shelter, but without access to water, shelter was only a beautiful inconvenience. Kivas were among the most important spaces in these settlements. They were usually round rooms, often partly below the surrounding floor level, entered by a ladder through the roof. In many Pueblo traditions, kivas are connected with ceremony, community, and deeper cultural meanings. Archaeologists can describe their physical features, but we should be careful not to claim more than we know about every specific use in the past. Still, their central role is clear. They were not random architectural decorations. They were carefully built and maintained. They often had a hearth, ventilation features, benches, pilasters, and a small floor opening that in later Pueblo contexts is connected with emergence traditions. In the cliff dwellings, kivas helped anchor community life within the stone shelter. Entering a kiva would have meant descending from the open space above into a more enclosed room. That movement itself may have carried meaning. You leave the exposed surface and go down into a circular space, closer to the earth, away from the canyon light. The ladder, the fire, the shape of the room and the gathered people would have created a very different atmosphere from the work areas outside. The kiva was a place where the social and ceremonial life of the community could be held. It may have been used for rituals, meetings, teaching, storytelling, planning, or other community functions. It reminds us that Mesa Verde was not only about surviving in a hard landscape, it was also about belonging, order, tradition, and shared meaning. The number of kivas in some cliff dwellings suggests that communities were organised in smaller social units, as well as larger groups. A large dwelling might contain several kivas, perhaps connected with different families, clans, or social groups. The exact organisation is complex and not always certain, but the architecture shows that community life was layered. People belonged to households, but also to larger groups. They shared the alcove, but not every space was used in the same way by everyone. The cliff dwelling was a community, but it was not a simple crowd. It had structure. Open plazas and work areas connected rooms and kivas. These spaces were important because they allowed activities that could not fit easily inside small rooms. People could gather, prepare food, work on tools, dry crops, repair items, and move between parts of the settlement. Children likely spent time in these open areas under the watch of adults and older siblings. Plazas are often where daily life becomes visible in a community. They are the spaces between private rooms and ceremonial rooms, between household tasks and shared activity. In Mesa Verde, these open spaces were shaped by the alcoves' limits. They were not broad town squares, but they mattered. Life above the canyon floor also meant constant connection to the mesa top. The cliff dwelling was home, but the fields were often above. Farming did not stop because people moved under overhangs. Corn, beans, and squash needed sunlight and soil, and those were mostly found on the mesa. This meant that people climbed out of the cliff shelter to work their fields, then returned with harvests, tools, and supplies. The home and the farm were separated by height. That separation is important. It added effort to daily life, but it also allowed people to place their living and storage spaces in more protected alcoves, while continuing to use the productive land above. Their world was not divided neatly into town and countryside. It was a vertical farming community, with home in the stone and food growing under the sky. The view from the cliff dwellings must have shaped the way people experienced the world. From an alcove you could look across the canyon, watch weather approach, see light change on the opposite wall, and observe movement from a protected position. The canyon was not only something below, it was part of daily awareness. The edge of the dwelling reminded people where they were. Height can make a community feel both safer and more exposed. You are harder to reach, but you also live with open space in front of you. The canyon becomes almost like another room, enormous and untouchable, always present beyond the walls. Children growing up there would have learned the architecture with their bodies. They would know which rooms belonged to which relatives, where food was stored, which ladders were safe where adults gathered, which places were forbidden, and how sound carried beneath the cliff. They would learn not from written instructions, but by being corrected, guided, watched, and trusted more as they grew older. Childhood in Mesa Verde was probably full of chores, teaching, play, and danger woven together. A child might help with grinding, carrying, gathering, caring for younger children, or working in fields. They might also find ways to play in the narrow world of stone, ladders, and shadow, because children have always been skilled at turning any environment into a place for imagination, even when adults are trying very hard to get something practical done. Elders would have carried memory. In a society without written records in the modern sense, memory lived in people, stories, ceremonies, songs, places, and repeated practices. An elder might remember past droughts, old settlement locations, family histories, planting advice, ceremonial knowledge, and warnings about mistakes already made. In a cliff dwelling, where the community lived close together, such knowledge could circulate through daily contact. The physical closeness of the settlement may have made teaching and remembering a constant part of life. Knowledge was not stored in books on a shelf. It was stored in people and performed through action. Food was more varied than corn alone, though corn was central. Beans provided important nourishment. Squash added food and useful containers or materials in some forms. Wild plants, pinyon nuts, fruits, seeds, and greens could be gathered when available. Animals such as deer, rabbits, and birds were hunted. Turkeys were kept and were especially important for feathers, which could be used in blankets and other items. Over time, turkeys also became more important as food in some areas. The diet was tied closely to season and availability. A successful household needed not only fields, but knowledge of the wider landscape. Clothing and textiles were also part of this life. Yucca fibre could be made into sandals, cords, mats, and other useful items. Cotton, traded or grown in some warmer regions, became important in Pueblo weaving traditions. Feather blankets may have provided warmth. Everyday clothing had to respond to a climate of hot days and cold nights. A person in Mesa Verde needed practical garments for work, warmth, movement, and ceremony. Objects that survive archaeologically, such as sandals or fragments of woven material, remind us that life in these dwellings involved constant making. People made what they needed from the materials around them or from goods acquired through exchange. Pottery was everywhere in daily life. Jars stored water and food, bowls held meals, cooking vessels sat near hearths. Decorated pottery carried style and identity. Broken pottery became part of the archaeological record, but before it broke, it was part of daily routine. Someone shaped it, someone fired it, someone carried it carefully, someone may have been annoyed when it cracked. Pottery connects the household to wider traditions, because designs and forms changed over time and linked communities across distance. In a cliff dwelling, pottery also had to survive movement along ladders and narrow paths. A large jar and a steep route are not the most relaxed combination, which may explain why careful movement was more than a polite suggestion. The towers and multi-story structures in some Mesa Verde dwellings add another layer of interest. Their exact purposes are debated. Some may have served as lookouts, ceremonial spaces, storage areas, or parts of connected room blocks. Towers certainly show architectural ambition. Building upward within an alcove required skill. Multi-level construction made use of limited space and created a more complex settlement. From the outside, towers can give cliff dwellings some of their most striking shapes, but inside the community, they were part of the practical and symbolic arrangement of space. They changed how people moved, watched, stored, and perhaps understood their relationship to the canyon. Daily life also included maintenance of paths and access routes. Ladders had to be repaired or replaced. Steps and holds had to remain usable. Roofs and walls needed attention. Plazas had to be kept clear enough for work. Storage rooms had to be checked. Kivas had to be maintained. In a place built into stone, the natural setting did not remove the need for constant care. If anything, the difficulty of access made maintenance even more important. A broken ladder was not a minor nuisance. It could disrupt movement through the settlement. A damaged storage wall could threaten food. A leaking roof could ruin a room. The community depended on upkeep. There must have been moments of comfort too. We should not let the hard work erase the ordinary pleasures of life. There would have been meals shared after long labour, conversations in shaded spaces, the warmth of fire in cold weather, the satisfaction of full storage rooms, the relief of rain after dry weeks, the sound of children laughing, the smell of food cooking, and the quiet of evening when the canyon settled into shadow. Ancient people did not live only as examples in a survival lesson. They had preferences, jokes, frustrations, hopes, and habits. Someone may have loved the view, someone else may have complained about the climb. Someone may have been proud of a newly plastered wall. Someone may have thought a neighbour's turkey was louder than necessary, and honestly, they may have been right. At night, the cliff dwelling would have changed. The canyon darkened quickly. Fires and lamps would have made small areas of light. The stone overhang above would hold darkness, while the sky beyond the alcove opened to stars. The settlement, so practical by day, may have felt enclosed and intimate after sunset. Sounds would carry differently. People would retreat into rooms or gather in certain spaces. The cold would come, stories might be told. Ceremonial activities may have taken place at particular times. The cliff, which in daylight showed its shape clearly, would become a protective mass above and behind the community. Living there meant sleeping inside the canyon's shadow, not as visitors do now, but as people who trusted the place enough to close their eyes. The relationship between rooms, ladders, kivas, and the canyon floor was therefore not just architectural. It was the structure of everyday experience. Rooms held households and goods. Ladders connected levels and controlled movement. Kivas held ceremony and community. Plazas supported work and gathering. The canyon shaped light, sound, access, and safety. Fields above fed the settlement below. Storage rooms held the future. Everything was connected by labour and habit. A cliff dwelling was not one impressive object. It was a living system. When we stand outside that system today, It can be tempting to call it mysterious, simply because we cannot enter every thought of the people who built it. But much of it also makes practical sense. People needed shelter, food security, community organisation, ceremonial space, and protection in a difficult period. The cliff dwellings gave them a way to combine those needs within the stone alcoves of Mesa Verde. Their brilliance was not in doing something impossible for the sake of wonder. It was in making an unlikely place work as a home. That may be more impressive than mystery. Anyone can imagine a strange ruin. It takes deep knowledge to build a functioning community in a cliff. Yet this way of life still depended on what happened beyond the walls. No matter how strong the masonry, no matter how careful the storage, no matter how meaningful the kivas, the people of Mesa Verde still lived by corn, water, soil, and season. The cliff could shelter the home, but it could not make the mesa bloom on command. Every ladder, every room, every stored jar was tied back to fields above the canyon, where farming in a dry world required patience, luck, skill, and an understanding of water so careful that the next part of the story has to return to the mesa top, where survival began not with stone walls, but with seeds placed into uncertain ground. The stone rooms of Mesa Verde may be the part people remember first, but the life of the community began in the fields. The cliff dwellings could shelter families, protect stored food, and hold ceremonies beneath sandstone, but they could not feed anyone by themselves. The real test of survival waited above, on the mesa tops where soil, seed, sunlight and rain had to come together in just the right way. Every room tucked inside the cliff was connected to the open land above it. Every ladder, every storage chamber, every cooking fire, every meal shared in the shade of the alcove depended on whether crops had grown under the wide sky. The cliff was home, but the mesa was the pantry, the workplace and the gamble. Farming in the Mesa Verde region was not like farming in a green river valley where water could be counted on every season. It was dry farming, shaped by uncertainty. The people who lived there had no large irrigation canals bringing a dependable river across their fields. They depended heavily on rainfall, winter moisture, soil conditions, careful planting, and knowledge built up over generations. Corn, beans, and squash were the main crops, but corn stood at the centre of the system. It was food, labour, storage, risk, and hope, all at once. A field of corn was not just plants growing from the earth, it was a community's future standing upright in rows, vulnerable to drought, frost, pests, and timing. Corn had already travelled a long road before it became central to life at Mesa Verde. Its ancestors were domesticated far to the south, in Mexico, thousands of years earlier, and over time corn spread into many regions, changing as people selected varieties suited to different climates. By the time ancestral Pueblo communities were farming on the mesa, corn was not new. It had already become part of a deeply developed agricultural tradition. But growing corn in the Mesa Verde environment required local intelligence. A variety that worked well in one region might not thrive in another. Farmers had to understand which seeds could mature in the available growing season, which fields held moisture, which locations were too exposed, and when a late frost might undo weeks of labour. The mesa top could look open and promising, but it came with conditions. The soil was not equally good everywhere. Some places held more moisture than others. Some were better protected from wind. Some warmed earlier in spring. Some were more vulnerable to erosion. Ancient farmers would have noticed these differences closely, not as an interesting hobby, but because their lives depended on it. They knew the land by repeated use. They watched how snow melted, how rain soaked in, how water moved after storms, and where plants grew best without human help. They likely planted in multiple places to reduce risk, because one field could fail while another survived. In a dry world, spreading risk is common sense. It is the agricultural version of not putting all your corn in one basket, which is also good advice because baskets can be surprisingly involved in ancient life. Rainfall in the Mesa Verde region is uneven. Some years are kind, some are not. The timing of rain can matter as much as the amount. A storm at the wrong moment may not help as much as gentle moisture during a critical growth period. Too little rain and the plants struggle. Too much at once, and water may run off instead of sinking into the soil. Late frost can damage young plants. Early frost can hurt crops before they fully mature. Hail can ruin a field in minutes. This is why farming here was never a simple matter of planting seeds and waiting. It required careful observation, patience, and the emotional strength to live with uncertainty. The farmers of Mesa Verde were not only working with soil, they were negotiating with weather. Water shaped every part of this world. It was not just needed for crops, but for drinking, cooking, washing, making mortar, and daily household tasks. Springs, seeps, seasonal drainages and collected rainwater all mattered. Some water sources were dependable, others less so. A seep spring, where water slowly emerges from sandstone, might seem small to someone used to rivers and taps, but in a dry landscape it could be precious. People knew where water could be found, when it might flow, and how far it was from home or field. Carrying water was heavy work. Every jar filled and transported represented effort. If you have ever carried a full bucket across a garden and felt personally betrayed by gravity, imagine doing that as part of daily life, over uneven ground, sometimes up or down steep routes, in a place where spilling water meant losing something valuable. Because water was limited, the people of Mesa Verde had to make the most of moisture in the soil. Dry farming depends on storing natural precipitation in the ground. Winter snow and spring rains could soak into fields, and farmers would plant where the soil retained enough moisture. Some fields may have been placed near drainages or in areas where runoff naturally gathered. Small check dams, terraces, or other simple water management features may have helped slow runoff and reduce erosion in some areas. These were not giant engineering projects on the scale of later canals, but they show a practical understanding of how water moves. In a dry land, you do not always need to command water like a king. Sometimes you need to slow it gently, guide it, catch it, and give it a reason to stay. The choice of where to farm was tied to the choice of where to live. Earlier communities often lived closer to the mesa-top fields, which made daily agricultural work easier. When some people moved into cliff dwellings, the fields did not move with them. The crop still needed open land above. This meant farmers had to climb out from the shelter of the alcoves and reach the mesa tops to work. That added labour, especially during planting and harvest seasons. A household might wake beneath the cliff, prepare for the day, climb to the fields, work under the sun, and return with tools, plants, food, or worries about the weather. The cliff dwelling protected the home, but farming still exposed people to the sky. Corn agriculture created a yearly rhythm. In spring, decisions had to be made about planting. Seeds from previous harvests were selected with care, because seed was not just food, it was next year's possibility. A household that ate too much of its stored corn risked losing planting stock. A household that saved seed through hunger had to trust that the next season would repay the sacrifice. Planting itself required preparation of fields and knowledge of timing. Plant too early, and frost might damage the crop. Plant too late, and the growing season might not be long enough. The right moment was never printed on a calendar with a cheerful reminder. It had to be read in temperature, soil, sky, memory, and advice from those who had seen many seasons. Once the corn sprouted, the work continued. Fields had to be watched and tended. Weeds competed for moisture. Animals might damage crops. Dry spells created anxiety. Farmers would have returned again and again, reading the plants for signs of stress. The leaves of corn can tell a careful observer when moisture is low. The soil can tell its own story. The sky becomes an object of attention. Clouds are not just clouds when your food depends on them. They are hope, delay, warning, or disappointment. A small storm passing in the wrong direction could be felt almost personally. Somewhere nearby, rain might fall where it was not needed, while your own field waited. Beans and squash added strength to the farming system. Beans provided protein and could help support a more balanced diet. Squash offered food and useful materials depending on the type. Together with corn, these crops formed a practical agricultural base. They also worked well in storage and cooking. But even with this combination, farming did not provide everything. Wild foods remained important. People gathered pinyon nuts, seeds, berries, greens, and other plants when available. They hunted animals such as deer and rabbits. Turkeys were kept for feathers and later increasingly for food. A resilient food system depended on variety. Corn was central, but a wise community did not ignore the rest of the landscape. Pinyon nuts, when available, were valuable. They are rich and nutritious, but pinyon crops vary from year to year. A good nut year could add important food. A poor year could not be forced into generosity. Wild resources followed their own rhythms, and people had to know them well. Gathering required timing, travel, and labour. It also required knowledge passed through families and communities. Which plants were safe? Which were useful? When should they be collected? How should they be prepared? These details rarely make ruins look more dramatic, but they are the quiet knowledge that keeps people alive. Storage connected the field to the cliff dwelling. After harvest, corn had to be dried and stored in ways that prevented spoilage. Moisture was the enemy. Rodents were another. Insects, theft, and simple mismanagement could all threaten stored food. The dry alcoves of Mesa Verde were useful for this reason. Storage rooms beneath overhangs could keep crops sheltered from weather. Some storage spaces were placed in locations that were harder to access, adding protection. A full storage room meant more than abundance. It meant time. It meant winter meals, seed for planting, and a buffer against failure. It meant a community could breathe a little easier. But storage also brings social questions. Who controlled the stored food? Was it held by households, by extended families, by social groups, or through community arrangements? How was it shared in hard times? What happened when one family's fields failed and another's did better? Archaeology can reveal storage rooms, but it cannot always show the rules that govern them. Still, we can be sure that food storage was not only a technical matter, it was social. It involved trust, obligation, status, planning, and perhaps tension. In a dry year, the difference between generosity and fear could become painfully real. Food is never just food when there may not be enough. The work of processing corn continued long after harvest. Kernels had to be removed, stored, ground, cooked, and eaten in different forms. Grinding corn was slow and physically demanding. It was often done with a handstone against a larger grinding surface. The motion repeated again and again, turning hard kernels into meal. This work took hours. It shaped the bodies of the people who did it. It produced the raw material for meals that fed households day after day. When we imagine life in Mesa Verde, we should hear the sound of grinding stones as clearly as we see the stone walls. The walls are impressive, but the grinding fed people. Cooking required fuel. Fuel required gathering wood or other burnable materials. The pinyon and juniper woodland around Mesa Verde provided resources, but heavy use could place pressure on nearby supplies. As communities grew, people may have had to travel farther for wood. Fuel was needed not only for cooking, but for warmth and firing pottery. Wood was part of farming life because food could not become meals without fire. A dry landscape might seem full of scrub and trees at first glance, but usable fuel near a settlement can be depleted over time. Every cooking fire drew from the surrounding environment. Farming also shaped settlement choices through population. When harvests were good, communities could grow. More people meant more labour, more children, more households, and more social energy. But more people also meant more mouths to feed, more fields needed, more wood gathered, more water used, and more pressure on the land. A growing population in a risky farming environment creates a delicate balance. Success can make a community stronger, but it can also make it more vulnerable if conditions change. If several good decades encourage expansion, a sudden drought can make that expansion difficult to support. The land that seemed adequate in generous years can feel much smaller in hard ones. Drought was one of the great forces in the late history of Mesa Verde. Tree ring evidence from the region shows severe dry periods in the 1200s, including a major drought toward the end of the century. For farmers depending on rainfall, this would have been devastating. A drought is not simply dry weather. It is a chain reaction. Crops fail or shrink. Stored food becomes more important. People travel farther for water. Wild plants and animals are affected. Social tensions can rise. Ceremonies asking for balance and rain may take on sharper urgency. Decisions about staying or leaving become harder. A long drought can turn a difficult place into one that no longer supports the old way of life. And drought does not arrive alone. It interacts with everything else. If population is high, drought is worse. If wood supplies are strained, drought is worse. If relations between communities are tense, drought is worse. If stored food is unevenly distributed, drought is worse. Environmental stress becomes social stress. The people of Mesa Verde were experienced and adaptable, but no amount of skill can make rain fall on command. At some point, even the best farming knowledge faces limits. The cliff dwellings may have helped protect food and people, but they could not create water where the sky withheld it. This is where the story becomes especially human. It is easy to admire ancient farmers in a distant general way, but imagine the emotional weight of watching a crop fail. Imagine seed carefully saved from last year placed into the ground with hope, only for the rains to come too late or too lightly. Imagine checking a field again and again, knowing that each week without moisture narrows the future. Imagine children needing food, elders remembering better years, and households quietly counting what remains in storage. Farming in a dry world required practical skill, but also emotional endurance. Hope had to be planted along with the corn, and hope is not always an easy crop. The people of Mesa Verde likely used multiple strategies to deal with uncertainty. They could store surplus in good years. They could plant in different locations. They could rely on social networks, trade, and kin connections. They could gather wild foods. They could hunt. They could move temporarily or permanently when conditions demanded it. They could adjust settlement patterns, including clustering in more protected places. The cliff dwellings fit into this larger pattern of adaptation. They were not separate from farming. They were connected to it. A protected storage room, a defensible alcove, and a community gathered close together all make sense when the food system is under pressure. Trade and exchange may have helped buffer shortages. Communities across the southwest were connected, and goods moved through social networks. Pottery, shells, turquoise, food, tools, and other materials could travel across regions. In difficult times, relationships beyond one village mattered. A household or community with strong ties elsewhere might have more options. Marriage, kinship, ceremony, and exchange all created pathways of support. In a dry farming world, social relationships could be as important as rainfall. A neighbour, relative, or allied community might provide help when a field could not. Still, there were limits. When drought affected large regions, everyone felt the strain. If many communities struggled at once, exchange became harder. People might compete for better land or water. Migration routes might become crowded. Places that once welcomed visitors might become cautious. Archaeologists have found signs in some parts of the region that conflict increased during periods of stress. We do not need to imagine constant warfare to understand that scarcity can change behaviour. When survival is uncertain, people may become more protective of food, land, and water. The move into cliff dwellings may reflect this atmosphere of caution as much as the practical advantages of shelter. Farming also carried ceremonial meaning. Corn was not only a crop in many Pueblo traditions, it was connected with life, identity, responsibility, and relationship to the world. Planting and harvesting were not merely economic acts. They were part of a larger order linking people, land, weather, ancestors, and the sacred. We should be careful not to speak too broadly or assume every detail of past belief, but it is clear that agriculture in Pueblo worlds has deep cultural significance. The success of corn was not simply a private household matter, it was tied to community well-being and spiritual responsibility. A field could be a place of work and meaning at the same time. This connection between farming and ceremony helps explain why the next part of Mesa Verde's story cannot be separated from kivas, gatherings, and shared belief. In a dry world, survival depends not only on technical skill, but on community trust. People need shared rules, shared obligations, shared rituals, and shared ways of making sense of uncertainty. When rain fails, people do not only ask what practical steps can be taken, they also ask how the world is out of balance, what responsibilities have been neglected, what ceremonies must be held, what relationships must be repaired, and what the ancestors or sacred powers require. The field and the kiva were not unrelated parts of life. They belonged to the same system of meaning. The tools of farming were simple by modern standards, but effective. Wooden digging sticks, stone tools, baskets, and pottery supported agricultural work. Without metal ploughs or draft animals, human labour did the work directly. Fields had to be prepared by hand. Harvests had to be carried by human bodies. Food had to be processed manually. This made cooperation important. Household labour was the foundation, but larger tasks could require help beyond one family. Planting, harvesting, construction, repair, and water management all benefited from social cooperation. The cliff dwelling, with its dense arrangement of households and shared spaces, may have supported the kind of community coordination needed in difficult times. The mesa itself was not one uniform farming surface. There were slopes, pockets of soil, drainage areas, exposed ridges, and places better suited to different uses. Farmers likely knew their land in great detail. They may have watched certain indicator plants, remembered which fields had produced well in previous years, and adjusted planting based on conditions. This kind of knowledge is hard to see archaeologically because it lived in practice. It was not always carved into stone. It was carried in bodies, habits, family teaching, and seasonal repetition. A field is a kind of memory when people return to it year after year. Harvest time must have brought relief, work, and calculation. If the crop was good, there was joy, but also the labour of processing and storage. If the crop was poor, there were decisions to make. How much could be eaten now? How much seed must be saved? Could other foods make up the difference? Was it time to seek help from relatives elsewhere? Was it time to move? These decisions were not abstract. They affected children, elders, ceremonies, and plans for the next season. The storage rooms inside the cliff dwellings were where these decisions became visible. A full room meant one kind of winter. An emptying room meant another. The daily meal tied all of this together. By the time food was eaten beneath the cliff, it had passed through a long chain of effort. Seeds saved from earlier harvests, soil chosen carefully, rain watched nervously, plants tended, crops gathered, kernels dried, food stored, corn ground, firewood collected, meal cooked, people fed. The simplicity of a meal can hide the complexity behind it. In Mesa Verde, every bowl of food carried the mesa, the weather, the labour of many hands, and the uncertainty of the next season. This is why the cliff dwellings should never be seen as separate from the agricultural landscape. They were not isolated stone puzzles. They were the residential and ceremonial heart of communities whose survival depended on farming in a dry place. The cliff could protect the harvest after it was gathered, but the harvest still depended on the mesa. The overhang could shelter walls, but it could not shelter crops from drought. The kiva could hold ceremonies, but the field still needed rain. The lives of the people moved constantly between these worlds, from the shadow of the alcove to the open exposure of the fields and back again. And when the droughts deepened, the limits of that system became harder to ignore. Communities could adapt for a time. They could store, share, move closer together, guard supplies and seek support through networks. But if the dry years continued, the old balance could break. Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings were built during a period of remarkable adjustment, and farming was at the centre of that adjustment. The question of why people built inside cliffs cannot be answered without asking how they fed themselves. Corn, water and survival were not background details. They were the reason every other decision mattered. The high desert did not defeat the people of Mesa Verde for centuries. They knew how to live there with skill and care. But the land always kept its authority. It could give enough, and then not enough. It could support villages for generations and then force difficult choices. In that tension, people built homes beneath cliffs, stored food in protected rooms, climbed to fields, watched the sky, held ceremonies, and tried to keep their community steady. Farming was never only about food. It was about time, memory, cooperation, and belief. And beneath the sandstone overhangs, where the rooms gathered close and the kivas opened downward into the earth, the practical work of growing corn met the deeper work of holding a community together when the dry world around them began to change. Inside the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the kiva was not just another room. It was not a bedroom, not a storage room, not a place where someone left tools because they meant to put them away later and then forgot. It was a space with a different purpose, a different feeling, and a different place in the life of the community. The rooms around it held food, families, work, and shelter. The ladders connected bodies from one level to another. The plazas carried the noise of daily tasks, but the kiva reached downward. It pulled people into a round space below the surface, away from the open canyon light, into a place where community, ceremony, memory, and identity could gather. To modern eyes, a kiva can look simple at first. It is usually round, often partly underground, with a floor, a hearth, a ventilation system, benches or ledges, and a ladder descending from above. But simple is not the same as ordinary. The round shape, the lowered floor, the controlled entrance, and the careful construction all tell us that the kiva mattered. In many Pueblo traditions, kivas are ceremonial spaces, connected with religious life, social organization, teaching, gathering, and the responsibilities that hold a community together. Archaeologists can describe the physical structure, but the deeper meanings belong to living Pueblo cultures and should be approached with respect. We can look at the stone and plaster, but we should remember that not everything important leaves an object behind. In a cliff dwelling, entering a kiva changed the body's relationship to the world. A person did not simply walk through a doorway on level ground. They descended by ladder through an opening in the roof. That movement mattered. You went down into the room. The canyon view disappeared. The sky narrowed. The sounds changed. The walls curved around you. The fire, when lit, brought warmth and light to the space. People gathered close, seated or standing in a room built not for isolation, but for shared purpose. Even if we cannot know every ceremony or every conversation that took place there, we can understand that the architecture shaped attention. It slowed the body. It focused the group. It made gathering feel different from ordinary movement through the settlement. The kiva also connected the cliff dwellings to a much longer history. Earlier pit houses, partly dug into the ground and used as homes, eventually influenced the form of later ceremonial rooms. That means the kiva carried memory in its shape. The people of Mesa Verde did not invent round, sunken rooms out of nothing when they moved into the cliffs. They brought an older architectural tradition with them. What had once been a common form of dwelling became, over time, a specialized space for ceremony and community. The past was not left behind. It remained built into the floor plan. Every kiva in the cliff dwellings quietly remembered older homes beneath the open sky. This is one reason Mesa Verde's cliff dwellings should not be seen only as clever shelters. They were not just practical responses to drought, storage, and defense. They were also communities with a ceremonial centre. A place can keep people alive, but a community needs more than survival. It needs rules, stories, shared obligations, ways of resolving tension, ways of teaching the young, ways of honouring the dead, ways of asking for balance when the world feels uncertain. The kiva helped hold those needs. It gave the community a place to gather beneath the same roof of stone, not for eating or sleeping, but for the work of being a people together. The number of kivas in some Mesa Verde cliff dwellings suggests that community life was organised in layers. Large alcove settlements often had several kivas, not just one central room for everyone. This may reflect households, extended families, clans, social groups, or other forms of organisation that we cannot fully reconstruct. What matters is that these settlements were not random clusters of rooms. They had structure. People belonged to smaller groups within larger communities. They shared the cliff, but they did not all use every space in the same way. The kivas were part of that social structure. They helped shape who gathered with whom, where certain activities took place, and how community identity was maintained. Imagine an evening in one of these dwellings after a long day of work. The fields above the canyon have been visited, water has been carried, food has been prepared. Children have been watched, corrected, fed, and perhaps chased away from places where they were being a little too inventive. Smoke has drifted along the stone, the sun has lowered across the canyon wall, the plaza begins to cool, then people gather near a kiva. A ladder leads down into the circular room. One by one, people descend. The open world above becomes quieter. Inside, the space is close and controlled. A fire may burn. The air smells of smoke, earth, plaster, wood, and human presence. The room holds the group differently than the plaza does. We should be careful not to imagine every kiva gathering as solemn in the same way. Human community life is rarely one mood. Some gatherings may have been serious, ceremonial and formal. Others may have involved teaching, planning, storytelling, or social activities. There may have been laughter, instruction, discipline, prayer, debate, and silence at different times. A ceremonial space is still used by human beings, and human beings bring many kinds of energy into any room. What made the kiva powerful was not that every moment inside it was dramatic. Its power came from repetition, meaning, and shared recognition. People knew what the space was for. They knew how to behave there. They knew what it represented. The kiva's features also show careful thought. A hearth provided fire. A ventilation shaft helped bring in air, important in an enclosed room where smoke could gather. The entry through the roof controlled movement and may have carried symbolic weight. Some kivas have a small opening in the floor, known in later Pueblo tradition as a sipapu, which is connected with emergence beliefs. Again, we should not flatten living traditions into a simple explanation for every ancient feature, but the presence of such elements reminds us that architecture can speak in a language of belief as well as function. A small opening in the floor may seem minor to an outsider. To the people who understood it, it could point toward origin, memory, and the relationship between the human world and the world below. Community at Mesa Verde depended on shared labour. Building a cliff dwelling required cooperation, and maintaining it required even more. Kivas likely played a role in organising that cooperation, whether directly through meetings and decisions or indirectly through the social bonds created by ceremony. A community that farms in a dry land cannot rely only on individual effort. Fields, storage, water, construction, defence, childcare, and ritual life all require relationships. People must know who they can trust. They must know what is owed, what is shared, what is private, and what belongs to the group. The kiva helped give shape to those relationships. In dry years, the importance of ceremony may have grown even stronger. When rain does not come, people do not only look at the sky with practical concern, they ask deeper questions. Have responsibilities been met? Are relationships in balance? What do the ancestors require? What ceremonies should be performed? How can the community restore harmony with the world around it? For agricultural societies, rain is not merely weather, it is life entering the field. Corn depends on water, and people depend on corn. This means that ceremony, agriculture, and survival are tightly linked. The kiva was part of that link. It was a place where people could respond not only with tools and labour, but with meaning. The relationship between corn and community was especially important. Corn was food, but it was also connected to identity and responsibility in Pueblo worlds. Planting, tending, harvesting, grinding, storing, and eating corn were not isolated tasks. They belonged to a way of life that linked people to land, ancestors, seasons, and sacred order. A harvest was not just a private success. A failed crop was not just a private problem. Food security touched everyone. Ceremonies connected with agriculture would have helped people live with uncertainty, strengthen cooperation, and place practical hardship inside a larger framework of meaning. When the future depends on rain, belief and labour often stand side by side. The kiva also served as a place where knowledge could be passed on. In societies without written books in the modern sense, important knowledge lives in practice, memory, speech, song, ritual, and repeated action. Younger people learn by watching, listening, participating, and gradually being trusted with more responsibility. A kiva could hold that process. It could be a place where stories were told, teachings were shared, ceremonies were learned, and the community's sense of itself was renewed. Knowledge did not float separately from place. It was tied to rooms, objects, gestures, seasons, and people. The kiva gave knowledge a home. There is a quiet strength in a room built for gathering. It says that people expected to meet. It says that shared life required space. In Mesa Verde, where rooms were crowded into alcoves and daily work filled every available surface, the kiva still received careful attention. That alone tells us something. Even when life was hard, even when farming required constant labour, even when water was uncertain, communities built and maintained ceremonial rooms. They invested effort in spaces that did not directly store food or shelter a sleeping household. That does not mean they saw ceremony as separate from survival. It means they understood ceremony as part of survival. Modern thinking often divides life into practical and spiritual categories, as if one is real and the other is optional. Mesa Verde challenges that. The same people who carefully stored corn also built kivas. The same people who watched drought conditions also gathered for ceremonies. The same community that climbed ladders with water jars also descended ladders into round rooms beneath the floor. For them, survival was not only about calories and walls, it was about keeping the world in balance, maintaining relationships, honouring obligations, and living within a pattern larger than the individual household. The kiva was where that larger pattern could be felt. The physical closeness of the cliff dwellings made community unavoidable. People lived side by side. They shared walls, routes, plazas, and access points. They saw one another daily. In such a setting, conflict would have had to be managed. Disagreements over food, labour, space, marriage, water, trade, or responsibility could not simply be ignored forever. A community needs ways to repair itself. Ceremony can do that. Shared gatherings can remind people of what binds them beyond immediate irritation. This does not mean ancient communities were always peaceful or harmonious. No human society is. But it does mean they had institutions, traditions, and spaces that helped manage the difficulty of living together. The kiva's enclosed shape may have strengthened that sense of unity. A round room gathers people differently from a long rectangular room. There is no obvious front in the same way, no far corner that feels completely separate. People sit or move around a shared centre. The fire, the floor, the ladder, and the curved wall create a focused space. This is not accidental. Architecture affects behaviour. A plaza encourages one kind of social life, a storage room another, a kiva another. The builders of Mesa Verde understood this, not as an academic theory, but through practice. They built spaces that shaped the life they needed to live. Some kivas in Mesa Verde are located in prominent positions within settlements, integrated with plazas and surrounding rooms. This suggests they were not hidden away as minor features. They were part of the settlement's core. A visitor or resident moving through a cliff dwelling would recognize them as important. Their roofs, openings, ladders, and surrounding spaces would shape movement. In some cases, kivas may have been covered by roofs and used as enclosed rooms. In others, their upper structures changed over time. What remains today is often the lower part, but in the past they were complete, functioning spaces. The empty circular depressions we see now were once rooms filled with air, sound, heat, and people. The presence of kivas also helps us understand why the cliff dwellings were not simply emergency refuges used briefly during danger. They were built for community life. A group does not invest in multiple ceremonial rooms if it is only hiding for a night or two. The cliff dwellings were places where people intended to live, gather, and maintain tradition. Their occupation may have been relatively short compared with the longer history of Mesa Verde, but it was not casual. It was organised and meaningful. The kivas make that clear. Ceremony may also have connected the cliff dwellings to the wider landscape. The people inside the alcoves did not live only within walls. Their ceremonial life likely related to the mesa top fields, springs, mountains, directions, seasons, and ancestral places. The kiva was not an escape from the landscape. It was a place where the landscape could be understood and addressed through community practice. The circular room beneath the floor and the open canyon outside were not opposites. They were parts of the same world. One held gathering, the other held distance, weather, fields, and movement. Life moved between them. There may have been seasonal rhythms to ceremonial life, tied to planting, harvest, solstice, rain, social events, or other cycles. The exact details are not ours to invent, but the broader point is clear. People living in an agricultural society pay close attention to time, not only clock time, but seasonal time, when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare, when to store, when to gather, when to ask for rain, when to give thanks, when to remember. The kiva likely helped organise these rhythms. It provided a place where the community's calendar could be enacted through ceremony rather than written on a wall. The builders also paid attention to orientation, placement, and relation between spaces. Some structures at Mesa Verde and in the broader Pueblo world show awareness of solar and lunar patterns, though interpretations must be made carefully. What is clear is that sky watching mattered in agricultural and ceremonial societies. The movement of the sun marked seasons. Shadows, sunrise points, and the changing length of days helped people understand the year. The kiva, as part of a built ceremonial landscape, belonged to that broader awareness of time and order. The community lived under the sky, but also beneath stone, between the cycles of the heavens and the shelter of the earth. Daily community life and ceremonial life were not separated by a hard wall. A person might spend the day farming, carrying water, grinding corn, repairing a wall, tending a child, and then take part in a gathering that renewed the meaning behind those tasks. The same hands that shaped mortar may have carried ritual objects. The same voice that called a child away from danger may have spoken words of ceremony. This is what makes ancient communities difficult to understand if we divide them too neatly. People did not switch from practical humans to ceremonial humans. They were both at once. The kiva also reminds us that Mesa Verde was not only a story of pressure and decline, it was a story of cultural strength. Even during times that may have been stressful, people continued to build meaningful spaces. They maintained traditions, they gathered, they taught. They worked to keep community life intact. This matters because stories of ancient abandonment often focus so much on collapse that they miss endurance. The people of Mesa Verde faced serious challenges, but they were not simply falling apart. They were actively responding, organising, and holding together as long as they could. At the same time, the kiva may have become even more important as stress increased. When resources tighten, communities need stronger bonds, but they can also experience more strain. Ceremonies can unify, but they can also reveal social differences. Leadership, ritual authority, access to knowledge, control of food, and responsibilities among groups may all become more significant during crisis. The kiva was a place of shared identity, but shared identity does not mean life was simple. It means people had ways of managing complexity. Under the cliff overhangs, ceremony and community may have been both comfort and necessity. A visitor today may stand near a kiva and see only an empty circular space. The roof is gone, the ladder may be reconstructed or absent, the fire is cold, the people are gone. But the form still carries a quiet force. It asks us to imagine gathering rather than isolation. It asks us to see the cliff dwelling not as a collection of separate rooms, but as a community organised around shared spaces. It reminds us that the most important parts of a society are not always the largest or tallest structures. Sometimes they are the rooms where people return again and again to remember who they are. The quiet power of the kiva lies in that return. A storage room protects food. A living room shelters a family. A wall marks an edge. A ladder connects levels. But a kiva gathers the community around meaning. It holds the practices that help people face uncertainty together. It connects older forms of dwelling with later forms of ceremony. It places the living community in relation to ancestors, land, crops, seasons, and the unseen order of the world. In Mesa Verde, this mattered deeply, because uncertainty was not a distant idea. It was in the sky, in the fields, in the storage rooms, and eventually in the decisions that would lead people away. The cliff dwellings did not empty because people lacked ceremony or community. They emptied because even strong communities can reach moments when staying is no longer possible. The kivas show us what people built to hold themselves together, but the next part of the story asks what happened when drought deepened, danger grew, resources tightened, and the old home beneath the sandstone began to feel less like a permanent answer, and more like one step in a longer migration. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde can look peaceful now, almost impossibly peaceful. The walls sit quietly beneath the sandstone overhangs. The doorways are dark. The kivas are open to the sky where their roofs have long since disappeared. Ravens pass through the canyon air, sunlight moves slowly across the opposite wall, and the whole place seems to rest in a silence so deep that it's easy to forget these were once homes built during a time of pressure. They were not made only for beauty. They were not made so that future visitors could stand across the canyon and whisper, "Well, that is remarkable." They were built by people trying to live through real uncertainty in a dry world where rain could fail, crops could suffer, resources could tighten, and neighbours could become either lifelines or dangers. By the time the great cliff dwellings were built, the people of Mesa Verde had already lived in the region for centuries. They knew the mesa tops, the canyons, the plants, the fields, the springs, and the seasons. They had built many kinds of homes before. They had raised families, stored food, held ceremonies, traded, moved, adapted, and remembered. So when we look at the late cliff dwellings, we are not looking at the first attempt to settle the land. We are looking at a response made by experienced communities. That makes the question of leaving even more interesting and more human. These were not people who failed because they did not understand their environment. They understood it very well. But sometimes even deep knowledge cannot make a hard place easy forever. Drought sits at the centre of the story, though it should not be treated as the only answer. In the late 1200s, the Mesa Verde region experienced severe and lasting dryness. For a farming people who depended heavily on corn, this was a serious threat. Corn needs moisture at the right moments. It can survive some stress, but it cannot live on hope alone, no matter how carefully hope is planted with the seed. When rain fails again and again, fields shrink in their usefulness. Harvests become smaller, stored food becomes more precious, seed corn becomes harder to protect. A family may begin the season with confidence, and end it counting what remains in storage with a very different feeling in the room. Drought is often described as if it were only a weather event, but for a community it becomes much more than weather. It becomes a social event, a household event, a spiritual event, and sometimes a political one. When crops fail, people have to make decisions. Who shares food? Who has enough? Who has too little? Which fields are still worth planting? Which water sources remain dependable? Should some people travel to relatives elsewhere? Should the whole community move? Should stored food be guarded more carefully? Should old agreements be renewed? Or have they begun to crack under pressure? A dry sky can reach into every room of a village. In Mesa Verde, water had always required attention. People knew where seeps, springs, and seasonal drainages could be found. They knew how moisture moved across the mesa. They knew which fields had a better chance in certain years. But a long drought changes the rules. The small water sources become more important. The best fields become more valuable. Stored food becomes a measure of security. Even if people had survived dry years before, a series of bad years could push the whole system beyond what it could carry. A community that had been strong in ordinary difficulty might become vulnerable under repeated strain. Population also mattered. During earlier periods, communities in the Mesa Verde region had grown. More people meant more energy, more labour, more ceremony, more children, more skill, and more social life. But it also meant more mouths to feed and more pressure on land, wood, water, and wild resources. In good years, a larger population can feel like strength. More hands plant more fields, build more rooms, gather more fuel, and defend more effectively. In bad years, that same population becomes harder to support. The food that once seemed enough does not stretch as far. The wood near the village disappears faster. The good farmland feels smaller. The distance to resources grows longer one tired trip at a time. It is possible that the cliff dwellings themselves were part of the answer to this pressure. By gathering people in sheltered alcoves, communities could protect food stores, control access, and live closer together during a time when caution mattered. The cliff offered a natural roof and a defensive advantage. It made some stored supplies easier to protect. It gave people a place where approach routes could be watched and controlled. But it also created costs. Living in an alcove meant carrying food, water, fuel, and materials through difficult routes. It meant climbing to fields above and returning to homes below. It meant dense living, limited space, and constant movement through ladders and narrow paths. People do not accept those costs without reason. Danger is harder to discuss than drought, because it can easily be exaggerated. It is tempting to turn Mesa Verde into a dramatic story of hidden fortresses and constant warfare, with every ladder pulled up in fear and every shadow holding an enemy. That is not careful history. The cliff dwellings were homes, not just strongholds. People cooked there, slept there, raised children there, stored corn there, and gathered in kivas there. But it would also be too simple to ignore the signs of tension in the wider region. Archaeologists have found evidence that some communities in the late period faced conflict and violence. Defensive locations, controlled access, burned sites, and human remains from certain places across the broader Mesa Verde world suggest that social stress could become dangerous. We do not need to imagine every day filled with fear to understand that fear may have been part of the atmosphere. A community under pressure may live normally most of the time while still making choices shaped by caution. People can laugh, cook, teach children, repair walls, and hold ceremonies while also keeping a closer eye on who approaches. That is one of the uncomfortable truths of human life. Danger does not always replace ordinary life. Often it settles beside it. A child still needs food. A roof still leaks. Corn still has to be ground. Someone still has to climb for water, even if the world feels less safe than it once did. The cliff dwellings reflect that mixture. They are practical homes, but many are also difficult to reach. They are sheltered, but not completely hidden. They allow community life, but they also control movement. A ladder can be a hallway, but it can also be removed. A narrow path can be a daily route, but it can also be defended. A high alcove can be a place of comfort, but it can also be a place chosen because the open mesa top no longer felt secure enough. The architecture does not speak in one simple sentence. It speaks in several voices at once, and one of those voices says that the world outside may have become less predictable. Food shortages would have made tension worse. If one village had a better harvest than another, the difference mattered. If storage rooms were full in one place and emptying in another, people noticed. If water sources became less reliable, access to them could become a source of conflict. This does not mean everyone turned against everyone else. Social networks, kin ties, trade, and ceremony likely continued to provide support. People had relatives and relationships beyond a single dwelling. They were not isolated households staring suspiciously across the canyon at every movement. But in hard years, even strong relationships can be tested. A drought does not simply dry fields. It can dry patience. There may also have been changes in belief, leadership, and social organisation. When a society faces repeated hardship, people may question whether older arrangements still work. They may ask whether leaders have fulfilled their responsibilities. They may wonder if ceremonies are being performed correctly, if relationships with sacred powers are in balance, if the community should remain where it is, or if movement has become necessary. These questions are not separate from practical survival. In Pueblo worlds, migration can carry meaning as well as necessity. Moving is not always a collapse. It can be part of a long tradition of finding the right place, restoring balance, and continuing life when one place can no longer support the people as before. This is why the word abandoned should be used gently. Mesa Verde was left, yes. The rooms emptied. The fires went out. The ladders were no longer used. The fields were no longer planted in the same way. But the people did not vanish. They migrated. They joined or helped form communities in other regions, including areas connected with Pueblo peoples today. Their descendants continued. Their traditions continued. Their histories did not end beneath the cliff overhangs. The empty rooms can make the story feel like a disappearance because stone remains where people do not. But the human story moved onward. Still, leaving a place like Mesa Verde could not have been easy. We should not imagine it as a simple decision made in one meeting, with everyone calmly agreeing that it was time to pack the pottery and head out after breakfast. Migration often happens in stages. Some families may leave before others. Some may try to stay longer. Some may move to nearby communities first. Others may travel farther. A village can empty slowly, unevenly, emotionally. People might return to old rooms for a time. They might leave behind items that were too heavy, too ordinary, too broken, or perhaps intentionally placed. The archaeological record can show that people left, but it cannot fully show the conversations that led to it. Think of the household decisions involved. What do you carry when you may not come back? Food, seed, tools, clothing, pottery, ceremonial objects, useful materials, memories. But bodies can carry only so much. A grinding stone may be essential, but it is heavy. A pottery jar may be useful, but fragile on a long journey. Stored corn may be precious, but bulky. A family leaving Mesa Verde had to choose between need and weight. Anyone who has ever packed for a short trip and somehow made it difficult with modern luggage can only imagine what such choices meant when migration involved walking, climbing, and uncertain destinations. There may have been grief in leaving. Homes hold memory. A wall built by a parent, a storage room filled after a good harvest, a kiva where ceremonies were held, a doorway crossed thousands of times, a view known since childhood. These are not easy things to leave behind. But staying could become harder than leaving. If the fields failed, if water was scarce, if conflict grew, if ceremonies and social ties pointed toward movement, then leaving could be the responsible choice. It could be an act of care for children and future generations. It could be survival with sorrow attached. The mystery of leaving Mesa Verde is therefore not a mystery because there are no clues. There are many clues: drought, crop stress, population pressure, resource depletion, social change, possible conflict, regional migration. The mystery lies in how all these forces came together in the lives of real people. Archaeology can identify patterns, but it cannot always tell us which moment made a family decide. Was it a failed harvest? A conflict nearby? A drying spring? A ceremony? A message from relatives farther south? A leader's decision? A household argument? A quiet realization after another disappointing rain season? The large causes are visible. The personal turning points are harder to reach. The timing is striking. Many of the famous cliff dwellings were built and occupied for a relatively short period before the region was largely depopulated by the end of the 1200s. That means some of Mesa Verde's most impressive architecture belongs to a final intense phase of settlement. This can feel surprising. Why build so carefully if people would soon leave? But humans often invest deeply in places during uncertain times. Building can be a way to stabilize life. It can be a declaration that we are still here. It can be an attempt to solve problems, strengthen community, and protect what matters. The fact that people later moved does not make the building foolish. It shows that for a time, they were trying to make Mesa Verde work. There is a quiet lesson in that. We often judge past decisions by what happened afterward. If a place was later left, we assume the choice to build there failed. But people make decisions from within their own present, not from the future. The builders of Mesa Verde did not know exactly how later decades would unfold. They knew their needs, their memories, their fields, their families, their fears, and their hopes. They built beneath the cliffs because it made sense then. Later, when conditions changed further, leaving made sense. Both choices can be intelligent. Both can belong to the same resilient people. The danger of the old disappearance story is that it turns living communities into a riddle for outsiders. It makes the empty rooms seem more important than the people who continued elsewhere. For a long time, visitors and writers described Mesa Verde as if its builders had evaporated, leaving only mystery behind. But Pueblo descendants have always mattered to this story. The people of Mesa Verde are connected to living communities, and those communities carry histories that archaeology alone cannot provide. The cliff dwellings are not the remains of a people who ceased to exist. They are ancestral places in a longer journey. Migration may have led many people toward regions with more reliable water, stronger social connections, or established communities where they could continue farming and ceremonial life. The Rio Grande Pueblos, the Hopi Mesas, Zuni, and other Pueblo places are often discussed in relation to these movements, though the details are complex and varied. People did not all travel in one direction as a single crowd. Migration is rarely that tidy. It is more like many streams leaving a high place after rain, each following a route shaped by land, memory, kinship, and necessity. Some groups may have joined existing communities, others may have helped create new ones. Traditions shifted, but they continued. Back at Mesa Verde, the empty dwellings began their long second life. Without daily maintenance, roofs weakened, some walls collapsed, plaster wore away, animals entered, wind carried dust. But the alcoves protected much of what had been built. The same stone overhangs that sheltered people now sheltered the evidence of their lives. Rooms remained, kivas remained, storage spaces remained. Tools, pottery, sandals, baskets and other traces survived in the dry protected spaces. The cliff, which had once been part of the solution, became part of the memory. It is haunting to think of the last days of occupation, but we should be careful not to make them too cinematic. There may not have been one final dramatic morning when everyone looked back at the cliff dwelling and said goodbye together. It may have been slower. One household left, then another. A kiva was used less often. A room was no longer repaired. A ladder came down and was not replaced. A storage space emptied. A doorway that had known constant movement became still. The The canyon did not announce the change, it simply received the silence, as landscapes do. And yet the silence was not the end. Somewhere else, people planted again. Children grew up hearing stories of places their families had left. Ceremonies continued in new settings. Corn was placed in different soil. Old knowledge travelled with living bodies. The memory of Mesa Verde did not need the stone rooms in order to survive, though the stone rooms helped preserve one part of it for later generations. The real continuation was carried by people, so the mystery of leaving Mesa Verde is not solved by choosing one cause and closing the case. Drought mattered. Danger may have mattered. Food shortages mattered. Social change mattered. The search for better water, better balance, and safer futures mattered. But the most important point is that leaving was not simply an ending. It was part of a long pattern of movement and adaptation. The cliff dwellings were one answer to a difficult moment, and migration was another answer, when that moment became too difficult to hold. As the rooms emptied and the people moved on, Mesa Verde remained beneath the high desert sky, its alcoves still holding the shapes of a community that had tried, with skill and patience, to make a home inside stone. The walls no longer heard the grinding of corn or the low voices in the kivas, but they kept the outline of those lives with unusual care. And that is why, centuries later, when people look into the cliff dwellings, they are not only seeing ruins, they are seeing decisions, they are seeing drought and courage, danger and planning, loss and continuation, all held in sandstone, waiting for the final question of what these dwellings still say to us now. Centuries after the last families left Mesa Verde, the cliff dwellings remained in the alcoves, held by the same sandstone that had once made them useful as homes. The fires went cold, the ladders disappeared or fell away, roofs weakened, plaster cracked, some walls collapsed. Dust gathered in rooms that had once held food, tools, voices, and the small ordinary problems of daily life. But the dwellings did not vanish. The overhangs protected them, the dry air preserved them, the canyon kept them with unusual patience, as if the land understood that one day other people would look across the stone and ask what had happened there. When we stand before Mesa Verde now, we are looking at more than architecture. We are looking at the remains of decisions. Every room beneath the cliff is evidence of a choice made by people who understood their world and tried to live within it. A wall says someone carried stone. A doorway says someone thought about movement. A storage room says someone worried about the next season. A kiva says community mattered. A ladder route says height was part of daily life. The cliff dwelling as a whole says that people can take a difficult place and make it work for a time, not by conquering the land, but by paying close attention to it. The first thing the dwellings still tell us is that ancient people were practical. This may sound obvious, but it needs saying because ruins are often wrapped in mystery so tightly that the human intelligence behind them is made to seem strange. The builders of Mesa Verde were not mysterious because they lacked reason. They were remarkable because their reasons were so carefully fitted to place. They used the alcoves because the alcoves offered shelter. They built with local stone because the stone was there and could be shaped. They placed storage in protected spaces because food mattered. They used ladders and routes that made sense in a vertical landscape. They built kivas because social and ceremonial life needed a centre. Their choices were not random. They were answers to real problems. Those answers were not simple, because Mesa Verde was not simple. It was a place of dry farming, seasonal uncertainty, high elevation, limited water, useful stone, broad views, deep canyons, and changing social conditions. To live there required many kinds of knowledge at once. A person had to know the land, but also the weather, the crops, but also the wild plants, the building materials, but also the ceremonial obligations, the paths, but also the people who used them. A community had to store food, repair walls, raise children, teach skills, manage conflict, and make meaning out of hardship. The cliff dwellings still whisper this clearly if we let them. Survival is never only one skill, It is a web of skills held together. They also remind us that beauty can come from necessity. The cliff dwellings are beautiful, but they were not built as scenic monuments. Their beauty grew from fit. Walls placed under stone, rooms tucked into alcoves, towers rising where space allowed, kivas set into plazas, sandstone blocks matching the colour of the canyon. The result is visually striking because it belongs so closely to the place. It does not feel like architecture placed on the landscape from outside. It feels like architecture grown into the landscape through work and understanding. That kind of beauty is quiet but strong. It comes from making something useful with care. Mesa Verde also asks us to think differently about home. A home does not have to be easy to reach in order to be loved. It does not have to be large, flat, convenient, or safe by modern standards. A home is a place where routines gather, where children learn what not to touch, where food is stored, where someone knows the sound of a familiar footstep, where work begins before sunrise and continues after sunset, where people complain, laugh, worry, heal, remember, and sleep. To us, a cliff dwelling may seem like an astonishing place to live. To someone born there, it may have been simply where life happened. That does not mean life was easy. The dwellings do not whisper only comfort. They also speak of strain. They speak of people making homes in protected places during a time when the world around them may have become less reliable. They speak of drought, of stored corn, of water carried with effort, of communities drawing closer together, perhaps because closeness was necessary. They speak of defensive routes, controlled access, and caution. They remind us that architecture often records anxiety as well as hope. A strong wall can be an expression of confidence, but it can also be an expression of concern. The cliff dwellings hold both feelings at once. They are shelters and warnings. They show skill, but also pressure. They show community strength, but also a world in which strength was being tested. That is part of why they feel so powerful. If they were only beautiful, they would be easier to admire and then leave behind. If they were only tragic, they would be easier to reduce to a lesson about collapse. But Mesa Verde is more complicated than that. It is beautiful and hard, clever and fragile, local and connected to a much wider migration story. Empty now, but not disconnected from living people. One of the most important things the stone still tells us is that the people did not disappear. The rooms emptied, but the people continued. For too long, stories about Mesa Verde used the language of disappearance, as if an entire civilization had simply faded into the canyon air. That makes the ruins seem more dramatic, but it makes the history less true. The people who left Mesa Verde moved to other places. Their descendants are among Pueblo peoples today. The traditions, memories, and cultural connections did not end when the cliff dwellings were no longer occupied. The stone rooms remained in Colorado, but the human story travelled onward. This changes the way we should look at the dwellings. They are not abandoned objects belonging only to the past. They are ancestral places. They connect to living communities, living histories, and living responsibilities. When modern visitors walk through Mesa Verde, they are not entering an empty mystery created for their curiosity. They are entering a place that still matters to descendants. That requires respect. The silence of a ruin is not permission to treat it as empty of meaning. Sometimes silence is just the form that memory takes when the people who understand it best are not the loudest voices in the room. The stone also reminds us that migration is not failure. This may be one of the deepest lessons of Mesa Verde. The people built carefully, lived intensely, and then left. Modern minds often see leaving as collapse, as if staying forever is the only proof of success. But human history is full of movement. People move because water changes, food changes, relationships change, beliefs call them, opportunities open, dangers grow, or the old balance no longer holds. To leave can be painful, but it can also be wise. It can be an act of survival. It can be a way to protect future generations. Mesa Verde was not the end of a people. It was one place in a longer journey. There is humility in that. We like to imagine permanence. We build homes, cities, roads, and systems as if they will always make sense. We make plans as if conditions will remain stable. But Mesa Verde reminds us that every society lives inside an environment, and the environment is never a silent servant. It has limits, it has cycles, it gives and withholds. A farming community in the high desert knew that directly. But modern societies know it too, even if our pipes, roads, supermarkets and glowing screens sometimes help us forget. Food still comes from land. Water still comes from somewhere. Climate still matters. Community still matters when systems are stressed. The people of Mesa Verde adapted for centuries. That should be the centre of the story, not only the leaving. They learned to farm a dry region. They built homes suited to climate and terrain. They developed storage systems, ceremonies, social networks, and trade connections. They responded to changing conditions again and again. The cliff dwellings were one of those responses. Migration was another. Their history is not a warning that humans are helpless. It is a reminder that human strength depends on paying attention and knowing when to change. The dwellings also speak about community. No one builds a place like Cliff Palace alone. No single person wakes up, stretches, looks at a cliff, and decides to tuck a whole settlement beneath it before lunch. It required shared labour. People had to gather materials, shape stone, carry water, place beams, mix mortar, maintain roots, and organise space. They had to decide how rooms related to one another, where kivas should be placed, how storage should be protected, and how movement would work. The finished settlement was made of stone, but also of cooperation. Every ancient wall is, in a way, a record of people working together. That cooperation did not need to be perfect. Communities are made of humans, and humans are rarely perfect for more than a few minutes at a time, usually while sleeping. There would have been disagreements, grief, rivalries, mistakes, and ordinary irritations. But cooperation does not mean the absence of tension. It means people have ways to keep living together despite tension. The kivas, plazas, shared routes and clustered rooms of Mesa Verde all point toward that shared life. They show that survival in the high desert was not only a household matter, it was a community project. The kivas in particular continue to hold a quiet power. Even empty, they draw attention. Their round forms interrupt the straight walls and rectangular rooms. They remind us that people gathered not only to work, but to renew meaning. They suggest ceremony, teaching, social order, and connection to older traditions. The roofs are gone now, so we look down into them from above. But when they were used, people descended into them. That change in direction matters. To enter a kiva was to move into a different kind of space. A space where the community could turn inward, toward memory, responsibility, and the unseen order that gave daily life its shape. Mesa Verde's stone rooms also tell us that ordinary life is worth remembering. Archaeology often becomes famous through grand things: palaces, tombs, temples, towers, gold, inscriptions, battles, kings. Mesa Verde is different. It is powerful because it lets us imagine households, storage rooms, grinding stones, doorways, fire smoke, sandals, ladders, food, children, repair work. The archaeology of daily life can be quieter than the archaeology of kings, but it may be more intimate. It reminds us that history is not only made by rulers and wars. It is made by people preparing meals, planting seeds, carrying water, telling children to be careful, and trying to get through another dry season. That is why the cliff dwellings feel close despite their age. We may not live in sandstone alcoves, but we understand the need for shelter. We understand concern about food. We understand the importance of family and neighbours. We understand the worry that comes when conditions change. We understand the sadness of leaving a home, even when leaving is necessary. The details differ, but the human pattern is recognisable. Mesa Verde is ancient, but not alien. The stone also warns us against easy explanations. Why did they build there? For shelter, yes. For storage, yes. For defence, likely. For ceremony and community, certainly. Because of drought, pressure, and changing times, yes. But none of those reasons alone is enough. The truth is layered. Ancient life was layered. Human decisions usually are. We often want one answer, because one answer is comfortable. Mesa Verde does not offer that comfort. It asks us to hold several truths together. The cliff was practical and meaningful. The move into alcoves was creative and pressured. The leaving was sorrowful and wise. The ruins are empty and still connected to living descendants. There is also something important in how the dwelling survived. They survived because the same geology that sheltered the people also sheltered their traces. Had these homes been built in a wetter place, much more might have vanished. Had they stood fully exposed on the mesa top, more walls might have fallen. The alcoves preserved the architecture long enough for later generations to see it, study it, misunderstand it, respect it, and keep learning from it. The cliff became a kind of accidental archive. Not a complete archive, because no ruin tells everything, but a rare and generous one. Still, preservation brings responsibility. A place that survives can be damaged. Walls can erode from touch, footsteps, weather, and time. Objects can be removed. Sacred meaning can be ignored. Tourism can bring admiration, but also harm if it is careless. To preserve Mesa Verde is not only to keep stones standing, it is to protect context, descendant connections, and the dignity of the place. The cliff dwellings are not simply beautiful old buildings. They are records of lives. They deserve patience and care. When the evening light touches the walls, it is easy to understand why Mesa Verde stays in the mind. The dwellings seem to appear from the stone and return to it at the same time. Their lines are human, but their colours belong to the cliff. They look fragile and enduring, close and unreachable, empty and full. They make us ask what a home is, what a community needs, how people respond to hardship, and what remains after a place is left behind. The answers are not loud. They are in the arrangement of rooms, the curve of kivas, the protected storage spaces, the marks of hands on stone, and the way the canyon holds everything in stillness. If the cliff dwellings whisper anything, it may be this. People are always making homes inside uncertainty. The Ancestral Puebloans did it with sandstone, corn, ladders, kivas, and stored water in a dry land. We do it with our own materials, our own systems, our own hopes, and our own worries. We build where we can, we adapt when we must. We gather with others because alone is rarely enough. We leave when staying no longer protects the future. And sometimes, after we move on, what remains behind tells others not that we vanished, but that we lived carefully in a difficult place. So when we return in our minds to that first view of Mesa Verde, the city inside a cliff no longer looks like a simple mystery. It looks like a human answer. An answer made of walls and weather, food and fear, ceremony and memory. It was not a city hidden away from time. It was a community living within time, responding to its pressures, making use of stone while the world changed around it. The people who built there are not gone from history. Their descendants continue, and the alcoves remain as part of a much longer story. And now, as our quiet journey through Mesa Verde comes to rest, imagine the canyon at dusk one last time. The sunlight has softened. The cliff face has turned warm and dim. The rooms beneath the overhang sit in shadow, no longer filled with smoke or voices, but still holding the shapes of lives that mattered. Somewhere above, the mesa top stretches under the sky, where corn once grew and rain was watched with hope. Below, the canyon gathers the evening. The stone keeps its silence, but not because it has nothing to say. It speaks slowly, in walls, in empty doorways, in ladders no longer climbed, in kivas open to the air, and in the reminder that every home, no matter how strong, belongs to a world that changes. If this journey has brought you a little calm, or helped you wander gently through an ancient place before sleep, I would be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and stayed with Just About Earth for more quiet stories from the deep past. And wherever you are listening from tonight, whether the hour is late or the day is just beginning, may the thought of Mesa Verde settle softly in your mind, a place where people once built beneath stone, lived above the canyon floor, and left behind not an ending, but a memory strong enough to survive in the shelter of the cliff.